Are you tired of feeling like your projects are blending in instead of standing out from the crowd? What if you could build something that instantly grabs attention, showcasing not just your coding skills, but setting you apart as a next level developer? In this course, I'll help you do just that by helping you create a site that combines stunning design with the latest advanced frameworks to make your work unforgettable. Welcome to BlockForge, a fully functional blockchain themed site. In this tutorial, we're not just creating a site, we're building a complete animated experience. You'll start with a captivating homepage that's designed to impress with smooth transitions and eye-catching animations in every section. Next, we'll create a fully functional blog with article pages that are designed to keep visitors coming back. You'll also build a dynamic careers page to highlight job opportunities, complete with animations that bring it to life. Finally, we'll craft a sleek contact page with engaging effects that make connecting easy and memorable. Every page isn't just coded, it's designed to impress. To bring this experience to life, we'll use a powerful tech stack that combines cutting-edge technology with best-in-class performance. You'll learn about Astro, which includes Astro Islands and content collections for easily managing content. We'll use React for building reusable components with best practices. Tailwind CSS will allow us to quickly build the site without ever leaving our component code, and Framer Motion for silky smooth transition effects that bring the site to life. As always, this site will be fully mobile responsive, so it'll look great on every device. Along with this course, I've included the starter code, the image files, the designs, literally everything you need to build this project completely for free. All you need to do is click the link in the description to access your free resources. When you're done with this course, you'll walk away with a project that doesn't just look good on your portfolio, it will also give you real-world experience that companies and hiring managers crave. This one project could be the difference between getting that next job and getting left behind. Now, before we get started, let me give you a complete walkthrough of everything you'll build in this project. As you can see in the hero section, as you scroll down, you'll have these large 3D shapes that move along with the scroll position and animated SVGs that add another level of polish to this section. When we go down to the feature cards section, you'll notice that they animate automatically, but if we hover over any one of these features, you can see that there's almost this light that turns on from this cut corner card that we'll create, as well as the 3D shape that animates along with that hover movement. Scrolling down below that, we have features with these large 3D parallax effects on either side that really add another level of polish to this section. And then down below that, we'll have a blog section that is complete with two columns that independently move from each other. And if we hover over those, you'll notice that those light up as well, just like our other cards did. And even in the testimonials, we haven't left anything out because those smoothly animate into the page. And in the call to action section, you still have 3D shapes animating with the mouse scroll. But we're taking this one step further because we're building every single page of this site. If we go up into the navigation, you can see we have blog, careers, and contact. As we head over to the blog, we still have an animated header, and each blog article animates onto the page as we scroll down. If we go to a blog article, you'll see that we still have our animated header, and of course, we have lorem ipsum for the article text, but you can read the entire article. Over in the careers page, we have careers that animate onto the page. And if we click one of those careers, we can see it takes us to the contact page where we can fill in our information. This includes a special cut corner input and cut corner text areas, as well as a cut corner button. This is the most impressive site that we've done yet. And I'm going to teach you how to build this whole site from scratch. Maybe you've never heard of Astro.js, so let me briefly cover why we're going to build this project on this framework. Astro is a web framework for content-driven websites, and it powers the world's fastest marketing sites, blogs, and e-commerce websites, including companies like Google, Microsoft, NordVPN, and NBC News. It features best-in-class performance with Astro Islands, and it also has something called content collections, so it's a perfect fit for sites that include blogs, which is what we'll be building. React is what we'll use to power our interface. It lets us build components and then combine them into screens, pages, and apps. For styling, we'll be using Tailwind CSS, a utility-first CSS framework that allows us to rapidly build websites without ever leaving our HTML. And Framer Motion is a production-ready motion library for React that enables animations, scroll effects, and so much more. Now, as a reminder, this is part 2 of this video series. If you haven't seen part 1, the link will be in the description. Enough talk, let's build. Now that we've completed our features grid, let's go ahead and move down to the latest posts section. This is the next section on the homepage. You can see it has a title and a description, and then we're using a familiar component, these cards, in order to show our latest posts to the user. We're only going to show 4 here, and each of these is going to have a different color based on the category that we've added for this particular post. Now, as you can see, we are only showing this in one column on the mobile view, but as we move over into the tablet view and we show the same section, we're going to have this in a 2-column grid, and then we're going to offset one of the columns. So we'll talk about how to do that when we get into the code. And of course, we'll make sure that we have our link to the blog where we can see all of the posts down here at the bottom of this section. Over in the desktop, it's going to look pretty similar to the tablet view. We're still going to have our offset card. We're still going to have our 2-column grid. And this is going to be an interesting section to work on. So let's go ahead and dive into the code. In order to get started with this section, let's go ahead and go into our source directory, open up sections, and create a new section called latest posts.tsx. And then that will be an exported React component. We'll also say export const latest posts. And that's going to be equal to a function that returns some JSX. We'll return a section element, and inside that section element, we'll say latest posts and save that. In order to hook that up into our page, let's go into our pages and we'll go into index.astro and we'll import that at the top of our file. So I'm going to say import latest posts from /section/latest posts, and then we'll drop that below our features grid. So I'm going to say latest posts here, just like we've done with our other sections, and then I'll save that, and we should see the words latest posts, if we've done this correctly, show up on our screen. Now that we have that there, let's go back into our latest posts section. Let's close out our index page, and I'm going to also close out my sidebar just to give our content a little more room to breathe. Inside of our section element, we'll go ahead and create a div with a class name of container. And that's just going to hold our content. And then for our content, we'll start with an H2 for the title, and we'll give this the content of your portal to everything blockchain with a period. And then below that, we'll also have the section description. We'll use a semantic p tag, and that's going to say keep up with the newest trends, comma, updates, comma, and insights in the blockchain world, updated weekly with a period. And then after we save that, we should see both of those show up, which we do. And then below that, we'll have some cards that look very similar to the features cards that we created earlier. That's fine. Let's just go ahead and create the content for those. I'm just going to create the content for one, and then I'm going to loop over it 4 times. So we're going to create a div to hold these cards, and for our single card, we're going to create a div for that as well. At the top of that, we'll create another div, and we'll put the word technology inside of that because we're just creating the content right now. And then below that, for the title for this card, we'll go ahead and create a semantic H3 tag. We'll say regulatory challenges facing blockchain, like so. And then we also want the post description here. So that's going to say understanding the regulatory landscape surrounding blockchain and what it means for the future of this technology. And below that, we also know that we're going to have a button and an arrow. So I'm going to create a div, and inside that, I'm going to have a semantic button tag that's just going to say read more. And then beside that, we're also going to have an arrow, which for now, I'm just going to have a placeholder word of arrow. Now that I've done that, we know that this is the wrapper for our cards, and then we're going to have 4 of these cards right here. So I'm just going to fold this up using my IDE code folding, and then around that, I'm going to wrap a dummy array just to be able to see what this looks like 4 times. So I'm going to say ... new array, which should spread a new array, and we can add a custom length of 4. We're going to fill this with a dummy value of 0, each of those items, and then we're going to map over those items. And for each of those items, we're of course going to have our item and then our item index, and then we can put some JSX on the page for each of those items. Well, I'm just going to copy and paste my div here into my new array. And after I save it, I should see that being shown 4 times on the page. So I see the word technology, 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 technology. That lets me know that it's shown 4 times on the page, and I've done what we wanted to do. Now that we have some content placeholders in this section, let's go ahead and start styling up this section, and then I'll show you how to add the actual content when we get to these blog posts after we've done our styling. Coming up into our section item, let's go ahead and add a class name of PY60. That will enable us to have some padding top and bottom. That should push it down to the right spot. And then for our H2, we'll say class name equals, and we'll want to change the font family with font heading. We'll also change the font weight with font black to make that nice and dark. We'll change the font size by saying text 4XL. That'll increase the font size for us. And then text center should push the text of this title towards the center of the page. For our description, after I scroll up and down a little bit so I can get this aligned with the reference image, I'm going to say class name equals, and I'm going to say text XL. That should make it the right font size. Text center will push it towards the center of the page. And then we'll also change the color of this text with text zinc 400. That will make sure that our color is a little bit darker than the title. And then we'll say MT8. If I'm not mistaken, that should push it down to be in the right position with a little bit of margin top. For our blog items, we'll also want to push those down. So I'm going to say class name here, and we'll give this more margin top. We'll say MT16 to give this 4 rems of margin top. And then we have these cards here. Now, before we start styling up this card, I would like to see if we can use the card that we already created up in our features cards up earlier in the home page right here. Now, the content doesn't look exactly the same, but if we can extract out what's reusable and then leave the content in here, we can have a reusable component that will not require us to create the styles for this card every single time. So I'm going to open up my sidebar and go back to that features cards section and see how we can extract this component. Down here in card data is where our cards are being defined. And let's just review this section real quick to see what styles there are and how we can extract this out. So this is the wrapper div. We'll definitely want that. We also can see that these 2 divs make up the cut corner light on the side of the component. And we also have the background, which is this div right here. Everything below this is content until we get to the footer, which is this div right here where we have our text button and our SVG icon. We're actually going to leave the footer in here because that's going to be reused, but of course we're going to pull the content out. That's not going to be in our reusable component. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and just fold this div up. I'm going to copy it, and then we'll come into our sidebar and create a new component for it by going into components, creating a new file, and naming this card.tsx. Inside our card.tsx, we're just going to say export const card, and that's going to be a component that's going to take in some props and return, in this case, just our pasted code here. There's going to be some errors because there's some things that aren't in here. There's going to be some things we have to change, but that's perfectly fine. Let's fold down our sidebar for a second and take a look at these errors. First error is the key equals title. Well, we don't need a key inside this particular component because that's going to be defined when we define our array. So I'm just going to remove that, and that will fix that error. The next one is our TW merge, which is a function we need to bring into this component in order to use it. We do want to use it still, so I'm going to say import TW merge from Tailwind merge, and that should fix that issue. We also have a color, which is going to define the color of this card or the color of this little cut corner here. We do want to bring this in as a prop. So I'm going to go ahead and define my props by saying props here. And we're going to give this a default of component props without ref of a div. So that's going to give it a class name and children and some other props that we need by default. And then we can go ahead and add to this and say we're also going to accept a color prop. And that color prop is going to be typed as a string. So now we've told TypeScript that we'll accept this as the props, but we haven't told TypeScript where this variable exists. So we need to destructure these props to grab a color variable from it. So I'm going to say const color is equal to props. That will destructure the color key out and give us this as a variable, which it does, and that fixes this error right here. As we move down, let's see what else we need to fix. So this is going to be the image, the pill image that you see right here. So I need to remove that because that's content of the card. We also don't need the title, so I'm going to remove that. We don't need the description for now because that's going to be defined every single time we define the card. We can define some different content, but we are going to leave in this footer right here. The other error that you're seeing is that we don't have this text button imported into this particular file. So I'm going to come to the top and I'm going to say import text button to import that text button component, and then that will allow us to use that like so. The only other thing I think we needed to do to make sure that this is set up for success, or a couple of things we need to do, one of them is certainly to accept children. We want to accept the content of this card, so I'm going to accept the children prop by destructuring that. The TypeScript definition for that is already going to be included in this component props without ref, and then I'm just going to bring this into a div and just say children here. After our absolute position background, but before our footer, that's where we're going to define that and then save that. That should allow us to have the children brought into this component. The other thing I want to review is the class names that we have here, because we do want to allow the usage of this component to be dynamic, meaning that we should be able to allow the adding of class names to this component if we need to, or we want to also see what is particular to a specific instance of a component versus what we'd want to use as a reusable component. So as I review the class names that are on this card, I see relative and Z0, which we need for our light. I also see P8 for padding 8, and at the medium size, it's switching to padding 10. I think I'm okay with that. We may want to remove that and make that relative to the way that we're using it, but I'm okay with that for now. We'll see if we can continue to use that. We also see that we have a max width of 320, and that switches to a max width of 448. Now this is definitely something that we don't want to keep in here, because we don't want to define the max width at the card level. We'd like to define that at the section level to say if we're using it and we need to define a max width, we can set it then. So I'm going to remove that, and then we have the group class, which enables us to do a couple of hover effects. So these are the ones we want to keep, but we also want to add the ability to be able to add a custom dynamic class like the max width, and we'll do that by surrounding this in a TW merge function and saying if we want to pass in a class name, we can do that. I'll just say class name here, and we'll destructure that class name from our props. So we're getting the class name from our props, and then we're passing it into this TW merge function and basically saying if there's any overrides needed, that's what the TW merge function is going to take care of. So after I save this, I believe this should be a completed card component the way that we want to do this. The only other thing I'm seeing as I scroll down is we might not always want this to say learn more. We might want to have some different button text, because if I look at my design as I scroll through, we can see that it says learn more up top, but down here it says read more. So I want to be able to accept a prop to dynamically change what this text button says. So let's go ahead and do that as well by going ahead and setting the type of that. So that's going to be button text, and that can be an optional string as well. So we say string there, and then we can destructure that from props as well, but just by saying button text here, that destructures that and gives that a variable name. And then we can dynamically change that by just inserting button text here instead of having the hard-coded button text. Now, it's optional, which means if someone doesn't pass in a button text, we should probably make it say something by default. So we can do that just by adding a simple or, and then saying learn more. So if someone doesn't pass in button text, it says learn more, but if they do, then it has the custom button text there. With that, I think our card component is complete, at least for now. So let's go ahead and X out of our card component. We'll come back and replace what we had inside of features cards with this new reusable card component. So I'm going to come to the top of this file and import that from import card from /components/card, and then down where we're using our card, I'm just going to go ahead and start using it by saying card here. And I just want to be able to be sure that I'm not deleting anything I need before I delete this div. So let's go ahead and just review that as well after I wrap this in this ending card. So it's kind of like a card inside of a card right now, but the thing that we know that we're going to need to change is we're going to need to grab this key and use this for this card. So we know that we're going to need that prop there. And then we're also going to want to set the max width at this card level. So I'm going to say class name, and I'm just going to add on these max width classes that we have right here for our card. And then after that, we can go ahead and start deleting some things. So I'm going to delete my outer wrapper. We know we don't need that anymore. I'm going to delete my light divs. We don't need that anymore. We also know we don't need our background because that's included in our reusable component, but what's not included is the content below that. So we're going to keep the content in there. We're going to keep the title. We're going to keep the description, and we already have a footer, so we can delete this div down here, and we can also delete the ending div that used to wrap our card component. After I save that, let's make sure that we didn't mess anything up. Let me scroll back up to my features cards and see that that still looks like the design. It looks like it does, which means I think we're good with this new reusable component up here. So let's then bring it into our new section and see if we can use it down here as well. So I'm going to close out features cards because I think we're done with that section for now, and then come back here and see how we can use our new card component. Coming back to the top of the file, let's go ahead and import that card component by import card from /components/card, and then I'm going to drop that into my array just by replacing this. I'm going to say card here. We're going to have a key of item index just to keep React happy. And instead of this ending div down here, we're going to have our ending card as well. So let's see what that looks like now that we have this component. It looks pretty good, actually. There's a couple of things we know we need to change. We need to change the text of this to say read more instead of learn more. So I'm going to say button text here as a prop. I'm going to pass it a string of read more, and that should change our button text. And then for our content, we'll of course need to style this up as well as passing it the colors that we need. But we'll not worry about the colors yet. Let's just go ahead and worry about the content styles. For our tag, let's go ahead and give this a class name here, and we'll say px3 for 12 pixels of padding left and right, and then py 1.5 for 6 pixels of padding top and bottom. We also want to make sure that the font is uppercased. This will also be our heading font, so I'll say font heading, and we'll also want to make sure it's the right weight with font extra bold to give it that 800 font weight. We'll want to split the letter spacing with tracking wider. We'll want to make the font the right size with text extra small, and then to fill in the background, we'll just give it a static value of BG fuchsia 500/15. That'll give it a background of fuchsia 500 with 15% opacity, and then we'll change the text color with text fuchsia 500 to give it that text color as well. Now we can see that it's taking up the full width because it's a div, so we want to go ahead and style this with inline flex. That'll make sure it doesn't take up the full width of the div, and we'll want to say rounded full to give it the border radius that we need as well. Let me go ahead and change this to toggle word wrap so that we can see all these classes added here. Moving down to our title, let's go ahead and give this a class name as well, and we'll give this a class of font heading to give it the right font family, font black to give it the right font weight, and text 3XL will give it the right font size. And to move it down from our tag a little bit, we'll also say MT4 to give it 16 pixels of space between our tag and our title. For our description, let's give that a class name as well, and we'll say text large to give it the right font size. We want to say text zinc 400 to give it the right color, and then MT6 should give it the 1.5 rems or 24 pixels of spacing between the title and the description. And then we know that we don't need our read more or arrow div anymore because that footer is being included in our card. So I'm just going to go ahead and remove that div and then save it again and see if our card looks like it should. It does look really good, actually. It looks exactly like the design. Now that our card is looking good, let's see if we can split out the content to make sure that there's a gap in between each of these. So this is going to be this div right here that's controlling this. We're going to say that it is flexed. It is flexed in the column direction. And then we also have a gap of 32 pixels between each of our cards. And now we can see that our cards are looking good. Of course, it's the same blog post every single time, so that's not going to match up perfectly, but we're going to import our content here in just a second. Now that our content is styled up correctly, let's see how we actually import the content for each of these blog posts. If we come to our sidebar, we can see that we have a couple of directories inside our source, and one of those is content. This is going to be where we're going to get the content for our blog. And this is actually one of the nice things about Astro.js is we have the ability to define this content in these markdown files and then use it inside of our page really easily. Now, if we look at one of these blog posts like this one, we can see that we have some data defined at the top, and then inside we have the actual content of the post written in Markdown. So this # here means H2. Just having the space here means this is styled as a paragraph. This is an H3. This is another paragraph, and below that is a list. So that's all Markdown content. But above that, we have the actual data associated within these 3 dashes that has a title key, description, we have a pub date, category, slug, and author. So each of those allows us to use the data for this particular blog post and then go ahead and map over it, filter it, do whatever we need to actually bring this into our page. And the way that that's actually hooked up is through something called Astro Collections through this configuration. So inside of our config.ts, you can see that we have a defined collection for blog, which has a type of content, and then it has what's called a schema, or the shape of the data inside of our blog post. So you can see it has a title that's defined as a string, a description as well, a pub date, updated date, category, and author. Each of those is defined as this data, and this allows our page to know what data is available to us, and then we can then use that data to go ahead and show the content from our collection. So in order to do that, we need to come into our page inside of our Astro component, because that's going to be where we can access that collection. And then we need to come to the top and see how we can actually get those posts, and then we can drop it into our latest posts as a prop. So in order to do that, what I can do is I'm going to import the get collection from Astro content, and then I can say const posts is equal to await get collection and then blog. So blog is the key of the collection that I'm going to get, and I'm just using this async await in order to get my posts every time I make a request to this index.astro. This post, if we look at it, it's going to be equal to an array, and it has this ID, it has a slug body, and then it has some data, and that's inferred from our schema that we defined inside of our defined collection function that we declared. So this is all coming from this content/config. That's what's defining the TypeScript type that's available to me right here. Now, in order to get the latest post, so what I want to do is get all of those, which I'm doing right here, and then I'm going to come down below that. I'm going to say const latest posts, and that's going to be equal to my posts dot sort, because of course we want to sort those by the publish date. So I'm going to sort those, and this is just going to be a basic sort function that's going to take two of our blog posts. We're just going to label A and B right now, and then we're going to say how we want to sort these in order to create our sorting algorithm. Now, if the publish date is equal, we don't want those to be reordered. So I'm going to say if a.data.pubDate.value of, this is going to give us essentially a function that gives us the number of milliseconds since the midnight of January 1st, 1970, which is a date thing. If that value is equal to the second post, b.data.pubDate.value of, then we're going to return 0, because it means we want to keep those in the same spot. Now, if they're different, we're going to say return a.data.pubDate.value of is greater than the second post, b.data.pubDate.value of. Then we're going to want to return a ternary function here that basically just says, okay, well, that should come first if it's greater, or last if it's less than. So essentially, if we have a publish date that's greater or later, then we want that one to return earlier. Otherwise, we want it to return later. So that's what's going to define our sorting algorithm. And then we want to take just the first 4 of these. So in order to do that, all I do is add a slice function on here. I'm going to say from 0 to 4 is going to be the start index and the end index of this. And this is just going to give me my 4 latest posts sorted by the pub date that I've defined in my schema. After I do that, let me save that, and then we can go ahead and pass this as a prop to our latest posts. So I'm going to say latest posts is equal to this prop of latest posts. And we haven't defined that as a prop yet that it accepts, but that's fine. We can go into our latest post component and make sure that we define that as a prop that this accepts. So I'm going to save this, come back to my latest posts component, make sure we bring in props, and then one of these props is certainly going to be this latest post. So latest posts, and this is defined according to TypeScript as a collection entry. This is an actual TypeScript type from Astro's content. As you can see, this import type collection entry, and it's going to be of a blog entry, and we're going to have an array of that. So that's the TypeScript type that we're going to have to use for our latest post to make sure that we can accept the right thing. So if we go back to our index page, it should be happy with that type, because that's the type that we're bringing in, this array of these content items. And then back in our section, we can then use these latest posts and map over them, just like we're mapping over our dummy array. So in order to start using those 4, let me go ahead and replace my dummy array with my latest posts for my props. And of course I haven't destructured this yet, so I also need to do that. Coming back up to the top of my file, let me go ahead and destructure my props by saying const latest posts is equal to props. That should destructure this and actually give me a latest posts variable. And then I can then use that to map over that. And we want to change this to probably post and then post index. And I'm going to replace my item index with this new variable named post index, and then just go ahead and save that. Now this does map over this 4 times, but we're not yet pulling out the content that we've defined in here. So then we can just go ahead and destructure this as well and start pulling out some of those data items that we have. So we know that we have data in here, and inside that data, we actually have the title and description and all of that. So I'm just going to pull out the title for now, and then I'm going to replace my title. So let me replace that with title and see what that looks like. And that's giving us now 4 different titles, and those titles are actually matching up with what we have in our design. So that's looking good. Now we just need to destructure some other content inside of our latest posts array in order to fill this in with dynamic posts. So let me go ahead and close out my sidebar to give us a little bit more room to work with, and so that we can see this a little bit better. So we have title. Let's go ahead and pull out the description from this. So we'll destructure description, and we'll drop that dynamic description in place of our static description that we had. So I'm going to say description right here, and that should enable us to use that dynamic description. And let's make sure that that is aligned as well, which it looks like it is. Now for the category, we also have that available to us. So let me look in one of my posts and see where that's defined at. That is defined right here as category. So we'll want to drop in a dynamic category as well. So let's pull out that category key, and then we'll use that to drop in a dynamic category for our categories, and we'll save that. And if we look at our posts, it looks like all of those categories are defined. And now that really the only difference is that we want to change the color based on the category that the post belongs to. So if the post belongs to sustainability, we want to change that color to this lime. If the post belongs to security, we want to change it to this violet or purple color. And we have this cyan color as well right here that we want to be able to change things to as well. So in order to do that, we'll probably want to define a custom function that takes the category and actually spits out a color, and then we can use that color to then change our card color dynamically based on the return value of that function. So inside of my source directory, I'm going to create a new folder. I'm going to call this utils, and then inside of that utils folder, we're just going to have a new file called postutils.ts. And then that's where we'll define our function that we export here. So I'm going to say export const get post color from category, and that's going to be a function that takes in a category string, and we can define that with TypeScript as well, and then it's going to return a value based on that category. Let me put in my sidebar again to give our code a little bit more room, and we're going to just make this a simple switch statement. So we're going to switch based on that category, and we'll return some different things. So if the category is sustainability, for example, we know that that color based on our design is going to be that lime color. So we're going to say return lime. If the category is innovation, we want to return, if we scroll up, we can see that that is the cyan color. So we'll return cyan there. If the category is security, make sure that's spelled right, we want to return the violet color. And then by default, if I use the default keyword, we'll return fuchsia. That's going to be our default post color. So after we save that, it'll prettify that for us with prettier, and then we can go back into our latest posts and go ahead and use that utility that we just created. So at the top of my file, I'm going to import get post color from category from utils/postutils, and then we can then use that inside of here to set our card color dynamically. So for our card, we're going to pass it in a prop of color, which it should take already, and then we'll just give it the output of get post color from category of whatever category that we have dynamically defined. After we save that, we should see our colors changing dynamically, all except for our tag, which we have set to this static color of fuchsia. So this would probably be a good time for us to break this out into a component that takes a color as well, so that we can change this dynamically as well. So I'm going to cut this right here, and I'm going to come into my sidebar and go ahead and create a reusable component for that tag. So inside of my components, I'm going to create a new file called tag.tsx. And in that tag, I'm going to export a const of tag, which is going to be a component or a function that's going to return the JSX that we defined right here. Now, this category obviously is not what we're going to want to have as the content of our component. We're going to want to take some dynamic children for this tag. So let me go ahead and define my props, and those are going to be component props without ref of a div. And then if I destructure those, let me go ahead and make sure, first of all, that we have our sidebar in to give our code a little more room, and then we have toggle word wrap on. But let me destructure that and pull out children from those props like so, and then I can use my children as the content for this div. So we still have all of our class names that we have here, and we have our children defined. The only other prop that we know you're going to want to take in is our color prop. So I'm going to say and color, and that's going to be an optional string here, and that will allow us to define a color prop that we can then destructure from our props as well. So color is going to be defined there. Now, if we use our TW_merge function, that will allow us to dynamically change the color based on the color that's passed in. So I'm going to use my TW_merge function, and we're going to wrap all of our class names with that. And then we're going to add some dynamic classes here at the end based on what our color is, like we did with our reusable card component. So I'm going to say if our color is equal to lime, for example, then we're also going to add a bg lime 500/15. And we're going to change the text color to text lime 500. So because we've used our TW_merge function, fuchsia is going to be the default, and then these are going to be the overrides that are going to replace the bg and text class names if the color is the lime color that we have here. So we can do this a few more times with color. If it's equal to cyan, we can do kind of the same thing. So we'll say and we'll just say bg cyan 500/15 and text cyan 500. And we'll do the same thing with violet. So if color is equal to violet, then we'll go ahead and replace our background with violet 500/15. And we'll also say text violet 500, and that will replace that as well. It probably wouldn't hurt to go ahead and accept a dynamic class name here as well, just in case there's any of these margins or anything that need to be changed dynamically. So I'm going to go ahead and also pull out our class name prop, which should already be included in our component props without ref, so we don't need to redefine it as a separate prop. And then we'll just pass it at the end here so that we have that dynamic functionality with our TW_merge. Now that we have a reusable tag component, let's come into our latest posts and import that from the top. So I'm going to say import tag from /components/tag, and then we can just use this tag right here. I'm going to say tag, and we'll fill it in with our dynamic category that we have here. And now, of course, we can go ahead and use this utility function that we created to also set the color of our tag. So I'm going to say color equals, and then get post color from category of our category that we're passing in. And that should allow us to have a dynamic tag color as well. So you can see that we have that dynamic tag color working. That's working really well. I like where that's at. Let's see if we have everything aligned by going ahead and overlaying what we have over on our right, our reference image on top of our regular image, and see if there's any adjustments that we need to make. So I'm going to come into my reference image and say overlaid, and then let's take a look at what is different. As I look at this section a little bit more closely, I can see that I have a small amount of difference in between my title and description versus my design. So if I scrub back and forth, I can see that my design is a little bit higher and my actual content is a little bit lower. So I think I need to change my top margin here. Let me adjust that by saying MT3 and see if that adjusts it properly. So let me scroll up and down just to get the image aligned, my reference image, and it does look like that corrects the problem. So let me scroll all through these 4 latest posts and see if things look right with the overlay design. It does look like it does. The only thing I'm seeing down here is that we also have a cut corner button that we forgot to add to the bottom of our section. So let's come below our div that holds our posts, our flexed column div, and let's go ahead and create another div down here that's going to hold our cut corner button. We can just start creating that, and that should import that as soon as we hit enter inside of our IDE, and then we can give that the content of read the blog. Now, when we have a place to put this, we'll probably go ahead and add a link here as well, but for now we don't. So let's go ahead and bring this button down to the right spot by giving this outer div a class name of flex and justify center to push it towards the center of the screen. And then we just need to say MT48, and that should give that the right margin top to align that with the button in our design as well. After we've done that, it looks like our latest post section in the mobile version is done as far as matching it with the design. So let's go ahead and pull out my reference image again to side by side, and then we'll move over into our other responsive views. In our tablet view, it looks like we have an overlaid image as well. Let's go ahead and pull that reference image over to side by side so that we can look at what the differences are. And of course, I'm going to pull my browser out a little bit so that we can get a better view of these images. So let me go ahead and close that. And then let's look at the differences between what we're seeing on the left, what we currently have, and on the right, what the design actually shows. So we definitely have an increase in the title size. I'm not sure. It looks like the description might stay the same size. And then we have a difference in the distance between our latest posts and our title and description. And we're also moving into a 2-column grid as well. So we wanted to make all of those changes in our code. So let me come back to my code by sliding my browser window back over, and let's see what we need to do at the medium size to align things correctly. First thing we want to do is go ahead and change our title size. We're going to say MD colon for medium. We're going to say text 5XL. That should increase our title size at this responsive view size. That looks like it's correct. And then we need to come down into our posts and figure out a way to create this as a 2-column grid. Now we're using Flexbox right now to control this, but we probably need to be using grid in order to change this dynamically. So I'm going to replace my flexed column right here with grid, and we're going to say grid calls 1 because we want this to be 1 column at the mobile view, and then when we get to the medium view, we'll say medium grid calls 2, and that should create 2 columns for us after we get to this medium view. Now that we've done that, let's see if we still have everything lined up correctly on mobile. It looks like that's still looking good. So coming back to my tablet view, let's see how this looks in my responsive view versus my design. So honestly, it looks pretty good. We are seeing our second column be lined up here, but the only real problem that we have is that each of our blog posts is taking up the entire size of our column. And of course, we can adjust that by going ahead and giving it a div around our card so that the card doesn't take up the entire size of the column. But as you're going to see, then we end up with a problem because our gap changes for our first post versus our second. They're trying to align the size when we use this grid here. So what we need to do is we need to go ahead and find a way to show all of our even posts on the left and all of our odd posts on the right in their own columns. So in the first column, we're going to go ahead and show our posts. So I'm going to create a div around here. This is going to be our first column that you're going to see right here. And I'm actually going to remove this other div because we don't need this anymore. I was just demonstrating the fact that you could show it, do what we were doing there. And then this is going to create our left column. Now our left column is going to hold our even posts. That's going to be an index of 0. It should also show the index of 2, but it shouldn't show the index of 1 and 3. Those are the odd posts that we want to show in another column over to the right here. So in order to do that, what we can do is we can take this grid column here, and when we're mapping over this, we can give this card a custom class name. So I'm going to say class name here, and we're going to say TW merge to give this a dynamic class name. And then we can say when the post index modulo 2, in order to do this, let's go ahead and add a class name here. And then we're going to use the TW merge function. This TW merge function is going to allow us to add a dynamic class name based on this post index that we're looping over. So we want to add a class for specific indexes. In this case, we want to hide the odd one. So these are going to be index of 1, index of 3 on up. So we could say something as simple if the post index is equal to 1, or the post index is equal to 3, then we want to add a class name of medium hidden, and that will ensure that those are hidden. Let's make sure our TW merge function is actually on the page because it's showing a little squiggly line. It doesn't look like it is, so I'm going to bring that in by just going ahead and hitting enter with that, and let's see if that works. And it looks like we have a little bit of a problem with the way that we're defining our statement here, so I just need to wrap this in parentheses right here, and that should allow us to say if it's equal to either one of these, then we want to say it's hidden at the medium view. So you can see now that we're not showing our post indexes of 1 and 3 over here on the left side. Now, in order to create our right side, we need to copy and paste this right here, and that's going to create our right side. And then in this case, we want to kind of do the opposite. We're going to say if the post index is equal to 0 or 2 for our even indexes, then we want to hide these over here. So we're hiding the odd ones on the left, and we're hiding the even ones on the right at the medium size. This will allow us to then have our columns where it's not going to force us to make these left and right columns the same size or the posts the same size on the left and the right. This is going to allow us to just create two separate columns that only show the even ones on the left and the odd posts on the right to get this kind of 1, 2, 3, 4 latest posts strategy going on. Now, of course, we've only done this at the medium size so far, so at the small size, we're going to be showing double the post. That's not going to work. Let's come back and just look at what this looks like real quick. So we see at the small size, we're showing our left column right here, and then we're showing our right column right here. Of course, that isn't going to be what we want to happen, so we need to adjust that as well. So I'm going to come back up to the top of my section and make sure that everything is adjusted correctly here. So at the small size, we don't want to show anything hidden on the first column, and the second column will just hide the whole thing. So I'm going to give this a class name of hidden, and that at the medium size, we can just go ahead and show it with medium block, and that should allow it to be shown at the medium size. So I come back down to my mobile view and just make sure that that looks correct. And it does, except for the spacing in between the posts themselves. So this is going to be a div here. We'll just go ahead and say that this is a class name of flex call, just like we had before we wrap this in a grid, and we'll say gap 8 as well to just make sure that those are split by that 32 pixels that we had before. So let's just double check and make sure that all these still look correct on the left and right, and it does look like they do. We're going to want to make sure that the second one is also flexed as well the same way. So I'm just going to copy and paste this flex style, and I'm going to put this right here. But of course, at the medium size is when we want this to kick in. So we're going to say medium flex, and that should allow that to work correctly. So let's just double check that our mobile size still looks good, and we'll come back over to our tablet view, stretch this out a little bit, and we'll see if this aligns with what we're seeing on our design. Overall, it does. We know that we need to adjust some spacing, and we know that we need to add this little bit of offset here as well. And of course, we can do that because we have our separate columns now. So let's go ahead and add those styles. I'm going to slide my browser window over just a little bit while we're working on our code, and I'm going to come up here, and where you see that right here, the wrapper for our cards is MT16. While at the medium size, we're going to want to change that to MT28 for that margin top of 7 rems instead. And let's see if that aligns it with our design. It looks like it does. The other thing we'd like to do is give a little bit of top margin to that second column that we're showing at this tablet size. So I'm going to say MT16, and I believe that should offset that the right amount. So let's look at what we have on our screen. Let's look at the design, and that looks like it's equal right now. So in order to check this versus our reference image, I'm going to overlay my reference image and just double check that everything looks right as I scroll down this particular section. The only thing that I'm seeing that's a little bit different is this read the blog down here. It looks like there's a little bit more space at this tablet view size. So I'm just going to double check that that is right, and then we can adjust that as well. It looks like the actual button is a little bit closer to the cards at this tablet size. So I'm going to say at the medium size, we'll say MT32 for a margin top of 8 rems, and that's going to actually pull that button back to the right spot at this tablet view. Now that that's done, let's take a look at what our desktop is looking like. So I'm going to slide this out again just so we can get a better view of our desktop. So we can see that we have this very wide title, but when we move into the desktop view, it looks like we're constraining that width a little bit. So we'll want to do that as well as change the title font size, but everything else I think should be equal to what we're currently seeing. So let's just go ahead and make those adjustments and then see if things look right after we do that. Pulling back to our code, and just giving it a little bit more space to breathe so that we can see our page as we're working with it. Let's go into the title. That's going to be our H2. And we know that at the large size, we want to increase this. We're going to say large text 6XL and see if that increases it, which it does. We also want to wrap this title section in some kind of a div to make sure that we're constraining the width of it. So I'm going to wrap both the title and my description inside that div, and I'm going to give that a class name as well to constrain this. And we're going to say max width 3XL to give it that max width of those 48 rems and save that. And then we want to push this towards the center of the page by saying MX auto, and that should push the content towards the center of the page. I can also see that my description is getting a little bit bigger at this size as well. So we can see that the text size, the font size is coming up here as well. So let's do that by just going ahead and giving this a large modifier, and we'll say text 2XL, and that should ensure that we have the font size coming up there as well. It's looking like the design right now, but of course we can double check. Let me pull out my browser and come to my reference image and overlay it and see if everything looks like it's aligned there as well. So as I scroll down, I can see that it is aligned with my reference image, including my button at the bottom. So I think that completes this section, at least for the static part of this section. Let's go ahead and move on to the next section. As we move past the latest post section, we move into the testimonials. In the mobile view, this is a stacked experience where you see 3 testimonials stacked one on top of the other. If we move into the tablet view and see what's there and scroll down, we see that there's actually only 2 testimonials in this section. We're actually going to hide one and show 2. And then in the desktop view, we show them side by side. So we have 3 next to each other. This is going to be a great case to use CSS Grid. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into the code. To start creating this section, let's go into our sections directory and create a new file, and let's call it testimonials.tsx. Inside that testimonials, we'll go ahead and export a const of testimonials section, and we'll make that equal to a function that returns some JSX. In this case, it's just going to return a section tag that says testimonials. After we've saved that, let's go into our page/index and let's import that testimonial section into here. So under my import for latest post, I'm going to import my testimonials section from /sections/testimonials, and then I can drop it below my latest post. So I'm just going to drop this in here and I say testimonials section, and that's going to be a self-closing tag. And as soon as we save that, hopefully we'll see the word testimonials over here on the right, which we do, which means it's correctly hooked up to our index page. So let's go ahead and close out the index page and come back to our testimonials, and then we'll start working on the content for this particular section. Now we know that this section contains 3 testimonials. So what we're going to do is we're going to essentially make some kind of dummy testimonials, and then we'll come back and fill in the data, and then we'll go ahead and hook everything up. So we have our section. Inside of our section, we have a div that's going to surround all of our testimonials. And then inside that, we're going to have a new dummy array. So new array with a length of 3, because we know there's 3 of them. We're going to fill that with a dummy value of 0. And then we're going to map over each one of those items. And for each of those items, all we need is the index. So we're just going to do it like that and include that parentheses. And then this is going to be what's going to surround our testimonial itself. So we're just going to have a div there. Now for the testimonial itself, we want to use a block quote element. And then for the person who said it, we'll use a cite for that content. So the block quote will surround the whole thing and then a cite below it. And then for that block quote, we'll add a p tag in here. And then this is where we'll start filling out the first one. So this one is the user experience is phenomenal, and the support team is always there to help. Highly recommended with an exclamation mark, and then we'll just go ahead and leave that there. And then inside of our site block is where we'll go ahead and create our avatar, our name, and our title. So I'm going to create a div around those. And then inside of my first div, I'm going to go ahead and create another div. So we have 3 nested divs inside of each other. This one right here is going to be the avatar. So I'm just going to write the word avatar there for now. And then inside of my second div, we'll also have a div for the name and a div for the description. So div for name and div for their title. So this one's going to be Erica Wyatt, and then the title is going to be product manager at blocklink. And that's going to be for our first testimonial. Now we are looping over this 3 times, so we should see the one testimonial along with our avatar, Erica Wyatt, product manager, and then should see that 2 and 3 times, which we do, which means that now that we have our content on the page, let's go ahead and start styling it up. And then we'll come back and actually fill this in with real data. We'll go ahead and create our data for that as well. So inside of our section, we know we need some classes here. So I'm going to put a class name here, and we're going to give it PY32, which is going to give it padding top and bottom of 8 rems. And we also want the background to be a little bit different color. So this background, instead of the normal 900, is going to be BG Zinc 800, and that's going to fill that in with the right color. For the first testimonial for our paragraph here, we're going to go ahead and change the text of that as well. So we're going to give it a class name. It's going to be font heading to change the font family. We're going to have text 3XL to make it the right size. We want the font to be black to be the 900 font weight. And that should make it equal to what we see over in the right-hand side. And of course, I forgot about my container where you can see the content is bumping up against the left and right-hand side of the screen. We don't want that to happen. So I want to wrap this div inside another div and give that a container class so that we have our container wrapping our content. So I'm just going to give this a container class, and then I'm going to end my div below my other one as well. That should keep the content from bumping up against the edges of the screen. And then for each of our quotes, we didn't want to add this inside of here, but of course we can go ahead and add our HTML entities to wrap our quote itself. So this is going to be an and LDQUO for a left down quote, if I'm not mistaken. And then for the one that's going to be at the other side, it's going to be and RDQUO for a right down quote. Now we haven't put this quote character in here, and that's because it's a specific HTML entity. In fact, it's a specific double quote. So we want to put in a specific HTML entity. For that, we use our ampersand, and then we say LDQUO, and that stands for left double quote. And on the other side of it, we want to use an ampersand RDQUO for right double quote, and that makes that special character that we see on the left and right hand side of our testimonial. Now, if we had just done normal quotes, if we had just done the normal one that's on our keyboard, it just doesn't look quite as nice, and that's why I did the HTML entity. So I'm going to go ahead and undo that and put it back to the left double quote and the right double quote. And then in our citation block, we also want to add some classes to this. So I'm going to add a class name to my site, and that class name is going to push it down a little bit. So I'm going to say MT8 for that. And I also need to give it the block class because it's apparently an inline element. And then down here in our avatar, we definitely want to change the classes of that as well. So I'm going to say div class name equals, and that's going to be size 16 to give it a 64 pixel height and width. We're going to give it a BG Zinc 700 to give it the right background color. We also want to say rounded full here to give it the right border radius, and then we can just go ahead and delete the avatar text inside of it because that's not really doing us any good right now. Whenever we create our avatars, we'll come back and go ahead and make sure that the background image is correctly added right here as well. Down below that, for Erica Wyatt text, we're going to say class name here, and we're going to say text large to make the text 18 pixels. We also want to say not italic so that it stops being the italicized font, and then we want to say font black, and that should make it the correct font weight. And then for the title, we'll say class name equals, and it's going to be text Zinc 400 so that it is the right color and is also not italic. So I'm going to say not italic so that we can add that font style normal to our block quote. Now for our block quote, we do have this semantic tag here. We really don't need this other wrapping div. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that div and just leave it as our block quote surrounding our testimonial. And then I also want to split the space between these as well as we need to work on our citation, getting this content flexed left and right. So I'm going to work on pushing things left and right first by coming inside of my citation and saying class name equals flex, and that should push my name next to my avatar. And then I'm going to say gap 3 to give it 12 pixels of spacing in between, and then items center should make sure that those are center aligned with each other. And then for the spacing in between my testimonials, I know that we're going to eventually want to use the grid here. So I'm going to give this a class name of grid, and then I'll say grid calls 1. That'll make sure it's just in one single column for now. And then I'm going to give it a gap of 16, and hopefully that'll be the right gap between these testimonials. It looks like it is, but in order to double check that everything is aligned, we of course need to make sure that we have the right content in our section instead of the dummy content that we currently have. Now this is the right content for the first testimonial, but of course it's not the same for the second and third testimonial. So we need to make sure that those are right. So what I'm going to do is come up to the top of my section and I'm going to create an array called testimonials. And then that's just going to be an array with 3 objects inside of it. And for the first object, we know that the text, we'll just make a text key here, and that text is going to be equal to what we put in our first object. So I'm going to go ahead and create that in there, and we need to make sure this is in one line because JavaScript does not like the multi-line thing with these double or single quotes. That's the text of the first testimonial. Let's go ahead and add in the name. We also want the title of the person. And of course, we're going to want an avatar image as well. So we'll go ahead and make spaces for all of those. And then in the first one, the name is going to be what we have down here. It's going to be the Erica Wyatt. The title is going to be the product manager of BlockLink. And the avatar image is going to be the avatar for this particular person. So it's going to be /assets/images/avatar Erica Wyatt.jpg. And that should be the right content for that testimonial. Now to test this out, we can go ahead and drop this content in here. So instead of new array 3, we can just start to drop in our first testimonial. So I'm going to say testimonials.map. Don't need to fill that anymore. And then we actually want to map over each testimonial. So we can just say testimonial here, and we can say testimonial index right here. One of the things I forgot when we first started mapping over this is we do need to add a key to this. So I'm going to say block quote key equals testimonial index, and that will keep React happy. And then we can start to fill in some of these testimonials. So the first one is going to be this one right here. We're going to say testimonial.text right there. And then inside of our div right here, we're going to have our name. So that's going to be testimonial.name. Under that, we're going to have testimonial.title. And then for our avatar, we want a background image of that. So I'm going to put a style tag here. I'm going to say background image is going to be URL, and then we're going to have a JavaScript interpolated string. So I'm going to say URL, and that's going to be testimonial.avatar image, and that's how that's going to work. Now that works really well for our first one, but of course we don't have the content for 2 and 3 yet. So let's see what that is, and let's go ahead and fill that in. Hopefully we can save that and see that refresh. So I'm going to say text here, and that's going to be our productivity has skyrocketed since we started using BlockForge. It's a game changer. Oops, I don't want to do that. I want to make sure that that dash is taken care of. It's a game changer for our team. Put a period there, that works. And then for the name, we have Noel Baldwin. For the title, we have lead developer of BitBridge. And then for the avatar image, it should be very similar to above, /assets/images/avatar Noel Baldwin.jpg, and that should handle that. So let's go back over and make sure that that showed up correctly after we hit our save button. And I do see that Noel Baldwin's testimonial is now showing up correctly. Now down here for our third testimonial, let's go ahead and fill that one in as well with the content that we have here. So that is text. And that is the integration process was seamless and the performance improvements are beyond our expectations. And then for the name, we have Harry Bender. For the title, we have CTO Crypto Solutions. And then for the avatar image, we have /assets/images/avatar Harry Bender.jpg. And let's see if that shows up correctly as well. So let's come back over here, and it looks like we have it showing up. Let me go ahead and pull out our browser a little bit so we can see them side by side. So we see that we have the third testimonial, the second one, and the first one. Let's just double check that our assets actually are there. So after I ensured that our avatars were actually in the public folder, it looks like they are a little bigger than the images that we see right here. So that just means we need to give another class to this avatar right here. We're just going to say BG cover, and that should ensure that it just covers the background instead of being too large for that background. And that looks like we're exactly on point in our mobile view. Let's just double check this by going ahead and overlaying our reference image on top and seeing if there are any problems with this testimonial section. And I'm not seeing any right offhand on the mobile view, so we'll go ahead and pull that back out and we'll go over to our responsive tablet view. Now, as I look at this, I know that on the tablet view, it's not going to be top and bottom, it's going to be left and right. So we need to update that, and hopefully that'll help us take care of most of our issues on this section. So let's go ahead and take care of that right now. What we know is that at the tablet view, we switch to 2 columns. So I'm going to say medium, a medium modifier, grid calls 2, and that should help us switch to that 2 column view. And then I'm going to make sure that if we have the third one or the second index, that we just don't show it. So that's going to be done with TW merge. So I'm going to give this a class name, and I'm going to say TW merge and hit enter. That should import it. And then I'm going to say testimonial index equals 2. And if that's true, then we add hidden onto that, and actually medium hidden, because that's where it's going to be hidden at. And of course, we aren't going to want this to hide on the large size, so we'll go ahead and say large block right away, because we know that we're going to want to bring that third one back. Now that we have that done, let's see if it is aligned with what we see in our design. So let me pull over my design, overlay it on top of what we see here, and it looks like there's a little bit more of a gap between our columns now that we're at this bigger size. So let's double check on that and ensure we put in the right values for that. So coming in here, we have a current gap of 16. It's actually reduced. So at the medium size, we have gap 8, and that leaves it with a gap of 32 pixels. And as you can see, as soon as I hit save, that covers that perfectly. We do have a little bit of something going on down here, and I think that's just the character that we used for our dash. It wasn't the extra long dash, it was actually a short dash. So that's going to be fine. I'm not going to worry about that because that's not super relevant to our design. So I'm going to leave that alone and let it be what it is. Over on the desktop view, we have a little bit of a difference here as well for sure. So let's go ahead and pull it out side by side and let's see what changed. So of course on the desktop view, we know that we're switching back to 3 columns, but we currently only have 2. So I'm going to pull out my desktop view so we can get a better look. That's our current page that we have. So let me push my sidebar back and give my code a little bit more room, and then we'll just make that one update. So we have medium grid calls 2. Well, that's going to be large grid calls 3, and that'll give us 3 columns at the large size. And let's see if that looks correct. It looks like there's a couple of differences still, and that may be just the font size that gets bumped up on this desktop size. So let's go ahead and try and do that. We'll come down to our testimonial text, and we'll go ahead and change the text 3XL to the large size text 4XL, and that should help to bump that up. And let's see how that looks on this size. That looks like it's right. So in order to ensure that, we'll go ahead and overlay our design on top of our code and just double check. And it looks like we do have a little bit of a problem still. And it looks like that's due to the gap in between our grids. So if I take my design, I push up the opacity of that, and I take this scrubber and I look back and forth, we have a little bit of a different gap on our large size. So I'm going to adjust that by coming up here and saying at the large size, the gap is now 12 or 48 pixels, and that should adjust that correctly. So let's see if our scrubber does its thing and it's perfect now, and it looks like it is. So let's go ahead and verify that just by bringing the opacity down again and just seeing if there's any problems that we notice. Now we still are seeing a little bit of an issue here with our dash not being as long, but that's fine. I'll leave that alone because that's not super important either. So with that, I think we have all of our responsive views done for this section, which means it's time to move on to the next section of the page. Coming back to our design, let's look at the next section of the page. So this is going to be this call to action section. You can see that it uses some of the same things that we used in our hero. So it has a couple of the 3D shapes, it has a couple of the hexagons, has a couple of the circles that we've created already, and it has, of course, a title, description, and button. So we want to take care of all those. We're going to take care of the content first, and then we're going to center these hexagons and put them on this part of the page. Coming into the tablet view, it doesn't change too much. The size of this title might change, but other than that, I don't think anything really changes too much about any of the paddings or anything like that. And then in the mobile view, it does get a little bit smaller as well, but of course, not too much changes. It just changes the number of 3D shapes that you can see in this mobile view. So we'll account for all of that with our responsive code. And of course, as always, we'll go ahead and start with the mobile version. Let's go ahead and head over to the code. In order to create our next section, we'll come into sections and create a new file called call to action.tsx, and that's going to be a React component. We're going to export const call to action equals a function that returns some JSX. We're going to return a section tag, and inside that we're going to say call to action, and that's going to be how we'll test this inside of our index page. So coming into our pages/index, let's go ahead and import that call to action section. So I'm going to import call to action from /sections/call to action, and then we'll drop that below our testimonial section. So this is going to be inside of call to action, and that's going to be a self-closing component. And if we've done that correctly, we should see the call to action text show up on the screen, which we do. I'm going to close out my index.astro page and go ahead and come back to my call to action. Now for the content of this page, there's not too much to it. We know that we're going to have a div class name of container just to keep the content away from the edges of the screen. But inside that, we're going to start with an H2 for the title. And inside that title, we're going to have the ready to get started text. For the description, that's going to be a semantic paragraph tag that's going to say start building using blockchain technology, comma, with Blockforge. And then we're also going to have our button. So we can just directly import that with cut corner button. If I hit enter, it should import it automatically. And then we have a text of get started. So that should be what we need there. After we've created our content, let's double check that we have the content on the page. I can see over here that content looks correct. So that means we can work on our styles. So the first style is going to be the padding that we're going to add to the section. So we're going to say class name equals, and that is going to be PY60 to give it 15 rems top and bottom. And let's scroll up so we can see our content again. And then for our H2, we need to style it up as well. So we're going to say class name equals font heading to give it the right font family, font black to give it the right font weight, and then it should be text 4XL for the right font size. Let's just double check on that. We also want that to be text center to make sure it gets scooted towards the center of the page. Interestingly enough, there is enough space. Let me pull out this so we can see this a little bit better. There is enough space for this either way, but for some reason in our design, instead of ready to get and then started being on one line, we actually have ready to and then get started on its own line. So in order to create that same effect, I'm going to wrap a span tag around my last two words, and I'm going to also add a class name to those. I'm going to say class name equals block, and that will make sure that those show up as a block level element, which means they're going to show up on their own line. Moving down to our paragraph, we'll add a class name to this as well, and this is going to say text XL to make it the right size. We also want to say text zinc 400 to make sure it's the right color. And then we want it to scoot to the center of the page with text center. And we want it moved down from the title, and we'll say MT8 to give it that 32 pixels of margin top. For our cut corner button, we just need to wrap this in a div to position it. So I'm going to wrap it in a div. I'm going to give that div a class name of flex and then justify center. That should make sure it goes towards the center of the screen, and then MT12 should ensure that it has the 48 pixels of margin on the top. After I've done that, I just want to check that everything is aligned correctly for this particular section. So I'm going to overlay my reference image on top and then give it a little bit of a scroll to see if there's any blurry parts, but I'm not seeing any right offhand. So I'm going to pull it back out to side by side. We could worry about the hexagons right now and the designs in the background, but I don't think I'm going to until we get to the desktop view, because that's when we're really going to get the best view to see if all of that is aligned properly. And then we'll come back down to the mobile view just to make sure we didn't mess anything up down here. But I think this is it for the mobile view. Coming over to my tablet design, let's go ahead and pull the tablet design out to side by side. And we can see that there's definitely a little bit of a difference. We have a difference in the constrained width of this section, as well as the title size is a little bit different as well. So let's go ahead and make those couple of updates at this medium size. So I'll make my title size update first. I'm going to come over and put my sidebar away so I can have a little more room to work with. These text 4XL is my current size. We're going to say at the medium size, it's going to be text 5XL, and that should increase that size correctly. And then my paragraph also has to be constrained in width. So I'm going to say max width 3XL. We'll give that max width of the 48 rems. And that doesn't seem to have quite done it. Let me double check and make sure that my page is refreshed. But let's go ahead and bring this down to maybe just XL and see if that helps at all. It does a little bit, but it seems like it's still too large. Let's try medium, or even going down to small, and that looks like that's the size we were going for. Let me come back to my design and see if that is correct. So we should see technology with BlockForge. We see technology with BlockForge as the last line. That looks right. So I'm going to say MX Auto, and that should go ahead and pull my content into the center of the screen. Once again, in this section, I'm not going to worry about the hexagons or shapes yet because we're going to do that in the desktop view, but I'm going to go ahead and overlay my reference image just to make sure everything else looks good, and it looks like it does. So I'll pull that back out to side by side, and we can work on the desktop view. Over in the desktop view, things are still a little bit different at this size. So I'm going to pull out my design, and we'll look at what's different. Certainly the text size is a little bit different. It looks like the title and the description get bumped up, and there might be some spacing changes, but we'll double check on that once we get these other issues corrected. Coming back to my code, let's go ahead and give this a large modifier and say text 6XL for that text size. And then we're also going to bump up our description size. So that's going to be a large modifier here as well. And that's going to be text 2XL. And hopefully that will bump it up enough. To double check that everything looks good on this section, I'm going to pull out my browser window a little bit more, and I'm going to overlay my reference image, and we'll just double check that the text looks like it's in the right spot, which it does. Looks like it's the right size. So that means we can get to work on our hexagons and everything else that's going on in this section in the background. Let me take my reference image, push it back out to side by side, and then let's go ahead and create these hexagons first. So that looks like coming in here, and we'll go ahead and wrap a div around all of our content. Now this div is going to be what's going to center our hexagons on our content itself. So I'm going to say class name here, and that's going to be relative, and that's going to be so that we can hold in some absolutely positioned divs. Now for our first hexagon, we should already have a component for that. So let me import that. I'm going to import my hexagon from component/hexagon, and I'm going to position that inside a div as well. So I'm going to say div here, and then I'm going to put my hexagon component in that div and give it a self-closing tag, and that should put my hexagon on the page, but as you can see, it's way too small. We definitely need to increase the size of that hexagon. It looks like it's 700 by 700 pixels, so I'm going to come inside here. I'm going to say my hexagon is going to be class name of size 700 pixels. That's going to be a custom value there in those brackets, and that should make it the right size. And then to get it into the right position, I just need to make sure that this div right here is positioned absolute. So I'm going to say class name equals absolute, and then to center it, we'll say top 1/2, left 1/2, negative translate x 1/2, negative translate y 1/2, and that should pull it directly to the center of this relative wrapper. And that looks like it is correct right now. And then for our second hexagon, we just need to essentially duplicate what we've just done with our first one. So for our second one, I'm just going to copy and paste what we had here, and then I'm going to change the size of this hexagon. So that looks like it's going to be 1100 pixels now instead of the 700, and it's still going to be centered. That looks like it's correct. Let me double check that everything looks right here, and it looks like it is the right size. To really check, I'm going to pull out my browser, and I'm going to overlay my design like I've done before. So let's go ahead and pull this over into overlaid. And we can see that, yes, the hexagons are exactly in the right position. Now we are seeing a little bit of overflow out of our call to action section. We definitely don't want that for this particular section. So I'm going to come back into my section and just say overflow hidden. That will take it and make sure it's hidden on both the x-axis and the y-axis, or both left and right and top and bottom. So as soon as I save that, we shouldn't see that overflow happening anymore, and indeed we don't. After we're done with our hexagons, it's time to add our circles as well. So let me go ahead and pull my browser window back in a little bit, and then we'll go ahead and start adding in these circles. So I'm going to say div here. This is going to be my absolute position div. So I'm just going to copy and paste what I have here, and that's going to go right here. That's essentially going to pull whatever we do to the center, and then we can adjust from there. That will make sure that even if the screen width changes, we still keep everything in the same place. That's why we're positioning it from the center of this section. For that circle, I believe we do have a reusable component for that as well. So I'm going to import my circle from my circle component, and I'm going to use that circle right here and just go ahead and put my circle in, and let's see where it shows up. Now, right now, it's exactly in the center of the screen. We don't want that, so I'm going to give this a class name of absolute, And then I'm going to adjust the top and left values. So I'm going to say left 0, and then we're going to pull this up to negative top 400 pixels. That's going to be a custom value. And let's see if that overlays our other circle as well. And it looks like it does, which means that these are the right values. We just need to drop in the image inside of it. So I'm going to drop in this cuboid image by adding an image tag and giving it a source of /assets/images/cuboid.png. And let's see if that gives it the right position. It looks like it's the right position, but it's not the right size. So I'm also going to give this a class name, and we're going to say size, a custom value of 140 pixels, and that should make it the right size, which it looks like it does. Now we're going to handle our cylinder exactly the same as we did our cuboid. It's just going to change position a little bit. So I'm going to do copy and paste this div down below it, and then we're going to make sure that it's in the right position and that it is sized appropriately as well. I've seen all kind of stuff happen over there, but if I scrolled up and down, it took care of that. So it's not going to be left 0 top 400 in this particular case. So we're going to change that to negative left 600 pixels and then negative top 70 pixels. And that should hopefully put it in the right position, which it looks like it does, but of course it's not the right shape. This needs to be a cylinder.png, not a cuboid.png. And that looks like it's right for now. So let's just double check. I'm going to pull out my browser window to a little bit bigger, and we're going to put our design on the right side and just look and make sure that everything looks correct. So I'm seeing my cuboid in the right position. I'm seeing my cylinder in the right position. They're overlaying my hexagon, and then everything versus our design looks exactly right. Let's look at our other mobile responsive views as well. So this is the tablet view where we see our cuboid and not our cylinder. And then over in our mobile view, as we scroll down, we can see that everything looks like it's aligned perfectly here as well. So we're going to do a lot of great animations in this section, in the hero, and all the sections really, but we're not doing that yet. We're going to wait until we come back and go through all of our different sections and do the animations. But for now, this looks perfect to the design, which means it's time to move on to our footer. Back in our design down in the footer, this is a pretty basic footer, but we are going to have to manage a couple of things. We have a logo, a nav bar, a copyright, all rights reserved text, and then a couple of social icons down here in the right. So we'll make sure that all of those are in there. Over on the tablet view, we still have all those things are just a little bit more squished together. And then in the mobile view, we actually get rid of the navigation altogether and depend on what we have in our top right navigation. So we're not going to see our footer nav in the mobile view. We're just going to see our copyright, our social icons, and our logo. So now that you have that overview, let's go ahead and dive into our footer code. To start creating our footer, let's go ahead and open up our sections folder and create a new file in there called footer.tsx. And then inside of that, we're going to export a const of footer, and that's going to be a function that returns some JSX, and that's going to be a semantic footer tag, and that's also going to say footer inside of it. After we do that, let's come into our index page and drop that footer at the bottom by importing our footer from /sections/footer. And then we're going to come down below our call to action and say footer, and then make sure that's a self-closing component. After we've done that and we saved, we should see the text of footer, which we do. That means everything is linked up correctly. Let's go ahead and close the index page and concentrate on the content inside of our footer. So let me put away my sidebar for now and just create this content. Inside of our footer, we're going to have a div class name of container. And then inside of that container, we're going to have an upper and lower div. So I'm going to say div right here. That's going to be the upper one. And then the second one is going to be the lower one. Inside of our upper div, we're going to insert our logo. So I'm just going to say image source equals /assets/images/logo.svg with an alt tag of blockforge logo. And then for the other part of this div, I actually want another div to make sure we can flex this left and right. On the other side, we're going to have a nav tag, and inside of our nav tag, we're going to have a few different items. So for now, we'll just put an item here, and we'll just go ahead and create 4 of these. So I'm going to just copy and paste that. And then for each of these, we're going to say home, blog, careers, and contact. Those are going to be our 4 nav items that we're going to include there. Below that, we have a bottom div. Inside of that, we're going to have on the left-hand side, we're going to have a paragraph, really, probably not a div. So that's going to be this paragraph, and it's going to say, and copy 20 2024, Blockforge, all rights reserved, and that'll be that. And then beside that, we'll have another div that's going to hold all of our social icons. So we're just, for now, we'll just have a div and it's going to say Discord, but we're going to replace that here in a second with a social icon. So let's see if we have our content on the page. So we have our logo, we have our nav, we have our copyright, and we have our icons. Now, in order to make this look correct, we'll go ahead and start adding our styles. So let me come inside of my footer and say class name, and that's going to be PY24 for 6 rems of padding, top and bottom. And then we know that we don't want our navigation to show up at all. It looks like our logo is the right size, but our navigation shouldn't show at this size. So I'm going to give this a class name of hidden for now, and that'll make sure that it's not showing for us. Below that, we have this second div right here that we're going to want to move down further. So I'm going to say class name equals, and that's going to be MT12. That should give it the 48 pixels of top margin. And then we also want to make sure that our text is the right color as well. So I'm going to say class name equals text zinc 400, and that should ensure that that's the right color. And then we need to worry about our social icons. We know that there's actually going to be 3 of these. So let's go ahead and go find these icons. Now we have a Discord, we have a Twitter one, and we have a YouTube one. So I'm going to pull out my browser window. I'm actually going to come into this little bottom bar here, and I'm going to go search for these icons actually using Font Awesome. So let's go to Font Awesome's page and see if we can find these different icons that we can use. So I'm going to go to my icons here, and we're going to search for Discord. It looks like it did find an icon for Discord, so I'm going to bring that up and actually go to the SVG for this and then copy this directly from here and then drop it into my page. So this is going to be the Discord icon, and I'm just going to drop in this SVG and see if it will work for React. And it looks like there's a little bit of an issue because it has a comment here. Now, I don't mind that comment being there, but we need to make sure that it's formatted for JavaScript. So I'm just going to go ahead and put that there. And then after we get to the end of that comment, I'm just going to go ahead and put another / ensure that that is commented correctly for JavaScript. And as soon as we do that, we should be able to close down this bottom bar and see if that allowed us to see our Discord icon. It does look like it's there. It's definitely a lot bigger than we want it to be. So we'll need to mess with the styles of this by adding a class name directly to the SVG. So I'm going to say class name equals, and we'll say size 5 and see if that is the right size, which it definitely could be, but it's really hard to see because it is so small and so dark right now. So we need to make sure that it is filled with the right color. So I'm going to also give this a fill of zinc 700 and see if that lightens it up correctly. And it looks like that might actually be zinc 600 that we want that to be. It looks like we might want that to be 500 for our icon to make it the right color. Now around this, we have this other div that we need to add in for our circle around our social icon. So I'm going to give this a class name as well, and that's going to be inline flex. It's going to be a size of 10 to make it 40 by 40. We also want this to be background of zinc 800, I believe, for it to be the right color. We also want the border radius to be rounded, so I'm going to say rounded full. And we want to push the icon towards the center with items, center, and justify center. And that should push the SVG towards the center of our icon. Now that we've done that, we also want to make sure that our icons are split from our copyright text as well. So we can add a little bit of top margin. I'm just going to say class name equals MT6 and see if that adds enough margin. It looks like it might be a little different. It might be an MT4 to add enough margin there. So in order to see if this is correct, let's go ahead and overlay our design on top. I know we need to add in a couple more social icons. We'll do that here in a second, but I'm going to overlay my reference image on top and see if we're out of alignment with anything. It doesn't look like we are, which means we can come back in and make sure that we have our icons, the proper icons for each of these. Now, for anything that repeats, we almost always want to map over those things and make sure we have some sort of data array and then read from that array rather than copying and pasting a lot of code. So in this case, we can still do that. We can come up to the top, we can say const social icons, and then we can go ahead and give that an array, and that'll be an array of objects that we can use to save our data. So the first one is just going to be, we're going to give it a key of icon, and then we're just going to copy and paste this SVG into this icon here. And if we do that, that should allow us to still see that icon. Let me just go ahead and see if we can map over this. So I'm going to say social icons.map, and then we'll map over each one. We'll say icon and icon index with another set of parentheses here. And then we'll, for each one, show some JSX. That'll be this div right here. And then we'll replace our icon here with icon.icon, and that should replace our SVG. And we need to give this another parentheses to make sure that it is correct. And that should show our SVG. So let me go ahead and find our other two icons, and then we can add them to this array, and that will allow us to show all three icons. So I'm going to create another one of these and another one, and that will make them all Discord for now. But let's go back to Font Awesome and see if we can find our other two icons. So let me come up to our search, and let's search for Twitter or X, and let's see if we can get one or the other. So we have this X Twitter. Let me grab the SVG for that, just copy and paste that. We're going to drop that in right here, save that. Of course, it's not going to work because of this comment here. So I'm going to make sure that it is properly commented by just giving it this /*, and then at the end of the comment, go ahead and giving it another // and a bracket. And that should ensure that it is a comment that works for JavaScript instead of HTML. And let's see if that looks okay. Let me come back down to here, and it looks like it's a little bit different because we of course made this our size 5 and like the fill zinc 500. So let me go ahead and add the same class names to that as well. After we do that, the Twitter one looks right. Let's go ahead and find the YouTube one as well. So I'm going to pull up my bottom bar again, go ahead and search inside of Font Awesome for YouTube. We'll grab that icon, grab the SVG, copy and paste it right into here in the third spot. We know we're going to need to make this comment correct. /*, and then at the end of the comment we're going to say // with a bracket, save that, and then we're going to copy and paste the same class as well, class name, and then go ahead and drop this right in the bottom of the SVG opening tag. As soon as we do that, let's go ahead and close out our bottom bar and see if all of those three icons are correct. It looks like they are. I'm not sure what happened to my reference image. Let me double check on that as well. And after I refresh my page, it looks like that is back aligned like it should be. So let me come back into my icons and go ahead and give them a gap as well. So we want these to be flexed with a gap of 6, and that should ensure that they're spaced out properly. The only other thing I'm seeing on the mobile design for my footer is that we see that we have this darker background versus the normal background of the rest of the page. So we need to add that in as well by just coming up to my footer and saying BG Zinc 950. That should be the darkest zinc color that we have, and that should make it the right color as well. So I'm going to overlay my reference image again, just double check that everything looks pixel perfect, which it looks like it is, which means we can move on to our tablet view after we pull back out our reference image. Over in the tablet view, things have changed a little bit because now we're showing our navigation next to our logo, and of course we're putting a little bit more spacing here and showing our social icons next to our copyright text. So we want to make sure that those updates are made. The first one is going to be taking our navigation and showing it. So we're going to say at the medium size, this is going to be display block. That should show our navigation. We also need to make sure that it is styled correctly. So we'll do that with text zinc 500. And then we want to add the right font. So font heading, we want the font weight to be right, font black, and we want them to be spread out. So we'll say flex gap 12, and that should spread them out. Now, we need to make sure that instead of medium block, we say medium flex because we're trying to flex these. So let me just go ahead and correct that. And that should make sure that they have the right amount of gap between them. And then for the logo div and the nav, we also need to make sure that those are flexed. So we'll come to our wrapping div and say class name equals flex justify between to make sure that they're spread to both sides of the page. And then items center should make sure that they're aligned to the center of each other on the y-axis. Coming down into the bottom div, we need to make sure that there is more spacing now that we are at our medium size. I'm going to include a medium modifier, and we're going to say MT48. That should ensure that there's the right amount of spacing there. And then we want to do something similar to what we just did. So I'm going to say flex justify between items center, and that should ensure that our copyright text and our social icons are flexed between, and then of course aligned to the center vertically. That looks correct. So let me double check and see versus my design. I am still seeing that there is some margin top here, that my MT4, that may be making a difference in the rest of my page. So let me just go ahead and take off that MT4 at this size. So I'm going to say medium MT0, and that will probably do the trick and bring it up just a little bit. So after I do that, let me overlay my reference image. Let me pull back out my browser a little bit so I can see what's going on. Just double check that everything looks like it's perfectly aligned. Looks like it is. So let's move on to the desktop view and see if there's anything we need to take care of over there. Over on the desktop view, let me just go ahead and overlay because it looks like it might already be right. So I'm going to overlay my design and just scroll up and down, and everything looks right as is. So it looks like we can just leave our desktop view alone and wrap up this section. Coming back down to my mobile view, it looks like we may have messed something up by not adding a medium modifier or a large modifier at the right spot. So I am seeing that my copyright and my icons are justified left and right, or justified between, and that's certainly not what we want at this particular view. So I need to make sure that at this small size, I'm not having this justified between or even flexed at that point. So I want to say medium flex, and that should ensure that it only flexes at the medium size, and then all the other stuff isn't really going to matter because the justify between and item center can't take effect unless the div is flexed in the first place. So all of my responsive views are looking good, which means now we can move on to some of the more exciting animations for this homepage. Now that we've created all of our sections statically, now it's time for us to add dynamic animations to each section. And we're going to start with the hero section by adding 3 different types of animations. The first one is going to be a scroll rotation animation where we're going to turn these 3D shapes based on the scroll position of the page. The second one is going to be a line that we're going to animate around these hexagons. It's just going to move around the outside edge of these hexagons. And the third one is we're going to take one of these circles and we're going to add a rotating border to that circle. So those are the 3 different animations that we're going to add to this hero section, as well as I forgot to mention this little mouse here. We're going to also make sure that is animated as well. So I guess there are 4 different types of animations that we're going to add to this hero. And we're going to do all of this with Framer Motion. So I'm going to scoop my code in to have a little bit more space for it. And then if we need to open up our screen again, we'll do that as well. We're not going to have any reference images at this point. It's all going to be based on what everything looks like as we go. And we're going to work from the desktop view and then just ensure that it looks good on mobile as well. It's just the easiest place for us to look at all the animations together. So if you open up the sections and go into the hero, let's go ahead and start by importing our motion component from Framer Motion, and then we'll talk about what we want to do from here. So the first thing I'd like to do is I'd like to start tracking some of the things in this hero section. So let's start by tracking this icosahedron image. And the way that we track any particular thing on the page is we need to set up a React ref. And that's basically just a way to track the actual DOM element itself. So I'm going to start with a const, and I'm going to say icosahedron ref, and that's going to be equal to a use ref. And then we're going to give that a default value of null. Now that use ref comes from React. Let me just go ahead and grab that from React just by hitting enter when that pops up, and that should be imported from React. After I save that, I want to add that to my icosahedron image. So let me go find that icosahedron image, and I'm seeing that we have both of these images here. Well, we want these to rotate together, so I'm going to have to add a div around these, and I'm going to make sure that that div has a class name of inline flex, and that will ensure that it wraps the images very tightly around there. So that's essentially going to wrap this image, and then this other one is positioned absolutely behind it, so we don't have to worry too much about it, but this will make sure that those are both grouped together and that we can rotate those essentially as one image. So I'm going to add the ref to this outer div. I'm going to say ref equals icosahedron ref, and that will attach this ref up here to that div that we just wrapped around our icosahedrons. And that allows us to control that with our use scroll. So with our use scroll hook, we want to import that from Framer Motion as well. So I'm going to say use scroll, and then I'm going to come up here and I'm going to then use that use scroll hook, and I'm going to give it some options. The first option is the target of the scroll. So for the target, it's going to be this ref right here that we have. And then we want to tell it over what scroll positions do we want to track this target. So that's going to be with our offset, and we're going to say start end, which means as the image itself, let's say that this screen were a little bit shorter. Let's go ahead and make this like 600 pixels tall. as the start of it gets to the end of the page until the image has gone all the way through and the end of it gets to the start of the page. That's the second option. So that's going to be end start. And that's essentially saying the whole time it's visible, we want that to tell us what percentage of that process it's gone through, and that's going to be all the way from 0% to 100%. So at this point right here, when it's just peeking onto the page, it's going to be 0%, and then when it's gone all the way up and it's exiting the page, that's going to be 100%. And we can actually get that value if we want to, or of course we do, by just going ahead and setting this const and saying that we want to get the scroll Y progress. Say scroll Y progress here, and then we can use that in order to dynamically rotate our image based on how far along this progress is. So I'm going to do that by going ahead and saying const icosahedron rotate. We're going to actually use transform. That's also from Framer Motion. So it's going to transform this value to another value. I'll show you how that works here in a second. So I'm going to use transform of the scroll Y progress. And as it goes from 0 to 1, we would like to transform it from 30 to negative 45. So this is going to be essentially the degrees that we're going to rotate it. So as it goes from just peeking up the page, it's going to be rotated 30 degrees. And then as it goes down, it's going to rotate to negative 45 until we can't see it anymore. So that's the rotation that we want to add here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this and bring it down to our icosahedron div. And I'm actually going to make this a motion div because of course we want to rotate this. So we want to make this a motion div. So I'm going to turn that into a motion div, which is essentially just a div with these Framer Motion superpowers. And then we want to control the rotation with that value that we created. So we need to go ahead and add a style on here, and in that style we want to add a rotate, and that's going to be equal to the icosahedron rotate value. And then let's save it and see what that looks like. Now obviously this is a very short page right now, but let's go ahead and see if we actually get that rotation. And we don't currently get the rotation, and the reason is because of the way that Astro actually works. So let's go back to our index page and talk for a second about how Astro works and what we need to do in order to enable client-side interaction. So Astro is a server-side framework, or at least by default, it's a server-side framework, which means all of these React components that we defined and Astro components get statically rendered, but they don't come with any JavaScript unless we tell it to also load on the client. So in this case, because we want our hero section to load on the client, we need to add this directive to say client load, and that will ensure that the JavaScript then loads on the client and that any interactivity can work on the client. So now that we've added client load, let's see if this is now working for us. And yes, it is. We can see that our icosahedron is definitely rotating as we scroll down the page. It's a beautiful effect. It's a great effect. And I really like how that looks. Definitely very eye-catching. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and work on some of the other 3D shapes to make sure that those are rotating as well. I'm going to go ahead and close out my index.astro and come back into my hero and continue adding our different motion divs. One of the 3D shapes that we want to rotate is this cube. So let's go ahead and make sure that we are tracking the progress of it as well and creating a ref for it. So I'm going to go ahead and create another ref and say const cube ref, and that's going to be equal to a React use ref as well with a default value of null. And then I can come and find my cube, which is going to be this image right here. And since motion can replace and add superpowers to any normal JSX element, I can just create a motion image instead of an image itself. So I'm going to say motion.img, and I'm also going to give this that ref. So I'm going to be tracking this motion image when I add this ref equals cube ref here. That will ensure that we have a way to track the scroll of this cube ref as well. So coming up top, I'm going to go ahead and create another use scroll. So const, we want to get the scroll Y progress of this equals use scroll. And in this case, we're going to track the target of cube ref, and we want the offset to be the same thing. Start, end, end, start. Essentially saying we want to track the entirety of the scroll as it's on the page in the viewport. And this scroll Y progress, since we already have a variable named scroll Y progress, we're going to have to rename this one. I'm going to rename it cube scroll Y progress. and that'll allow us to differentiate that. And then we'll also have a separate transform for it, so we can have it independently rotating from our icosahedron. So we can use a separate value for that. So I'm going to say const cube rotate, and that's going to be equal to another use transform, and it's going to track this cube scroll y progress value. And as it goes from 0 to 1, or as it scrolls through the viewport, we want to give this a rotation value between 100 and -45. Now, it's never going to really get all the way down here at the bottom of the page. So by giving it a larger value here, we kind of want it to go from 45 to -45, but since it never really reaches that 0 value, then we have to give it a little bit of an offset here to be able to just have more of an effect, since you're not seeing it for very long. So the scroll effect has to be pretty intense in order for it to be something that's noticeable here. So that's going to be our cube rotate value, and then we can come down to our image and we can give this a style as well and just say the rotation is going to be whatever our cube rotate value is. And as soon as we save that, we should see it rotate, and we do, and you can see that as we scroll, then we're seeing that cube begin to rotate. So that looks great as well. Let me just go ahead and refresh the page one more time and make sure everything looks good there, and it looks like it does. So I'm happy with that. Let's go ahead and see what else we can rotate in this section. Another thing we're going to want to rotate is this torus. This isn't going to be super noticeable because it is a circular object, but it is still a nice effect when we rotate this as well. So we're going to add another ref for it. So I'm going to say const torus ref, and that's going to be equal to use ref with a default value of null. And then we also want to kind of do the same thing with a scroll tracking and a rotate value here as well. So I'm going to say const scroll y progress, and we're going to rename that to torus scroll y progress, and that's going to be equal to a use scroll that's going to target that torus ref, and it's going to have the same offset. So the offset's going to be start and end start. And then we need to go ahead and transform that as well. Of course, we haven't added our ref on the page yet. We'll get to that here in a second, but I'm going to go ahead and set this up. So I'm going to say const torus rotate, and that's going to be equal to a use transform. As the torus scroll y progress goes from 0 to 1, we're going to go from 20 to -20. And that's just going to rotate that. And then we need to go ahead and add our values to the page. So I'm going to take this torus ref and come down to my torus image and make sure that my ref is added to that. So it's tracking the scroll position of that torus. And then we also want to have the same thing, a style of rotate. And we want to say torus rotate there. And of course, this doesn't exist on a normal image. We need to make this a motion image as well. So motion.img should take care of having that style attribute the way that we need it. So as we rotate and as we continue to scroll down the page, we can see that that torus just kind of slightly rotates. It's not a super noticeable effect, but it is a very clean, and it adds another level of polish to this particular section. So I definitely like that. The last thing we're going to want to rotate here is going to be this cuboid, and that's definitely a more in-your-face shape, so it's definitely going to be a little bit more of a dynamic effect. So let's go ahead and finish off with that one. So I'm going to say const cuboid ref, and that's going to be equal to use ref of null again. We're going to do a very similar thing here, so I'm just kind of copy and paste what we have and say that this is going to be the cuboid scroll y progress. So we'll track the scroll position of it. We have the target, which is of course going to be the cuboid ref. And then we're going to make sure and transform that value as well. So const cuboid rotate is going to be equal to a use transform of the cuboid scroll y progress. And as it goes from 0 to 1, we are going to want to rotate it from 20 to -20 as well. So let's go ahead and add a couple of these values down here on our cuboid image. That's going to be this one right here. We're going to say the ref is the cuboid ref, and the style is equal to rotate, and that's going to be cuboid rotate. And of course, we need our motion.image here as well, motion.img. So now that we have that on there, let's see if we see that rotating as well, and we do. Once again, it's not super noticeable, but it's just that little level of having this image rotate as we rotate up and down the page. It just adds that level of interestingness. It really gives the user something to look at and be amazed by as they scroll down the page. So that's the 4 different shapes. Those are all working. Let's go ahead and pull this back out and increase our height a little bit to 900 and just see what this looks like at this size. So when we're all the way up, this cube essentially kind of keeps its current position. And as we scroll down the page, we see it moving, we see our icosahedron moving, we see our torus rotating, and we see our cuboid rotating. And that's just a really great effect there. But of course, we're not done with this section yet because there's a few other things we want to do. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to control our circle animation. This one's going to be kind of an interesting one as well. So let's go into our circle. Let's talk about how we're going to make our circle actually animate. So in order to have our circle border animate without having the entire circle animate, that means we need to split the actual circle div itself from the border that's going to rotate, because we don't want the interior of it rotating just because the circle itself is rotating. So we have right now an outline here. We want to split this into another div. So I'm actually going to create a div within our div, and that's going to be the outline that we have here. So I'm going to cut our outline from here. Just go ahead and hit Command X on the Mac and have a class name here of our outline classes. So this is going to be our border outline. And of course, we're going to want to make this relative up here. So we're going to say relative here, and then this class here is going to be absolute. Of course, we're going to want to make it the same size as our circle. So we're going to say inset 0. That should hopefully make it the same size. And then we want it to be rounded full, of course, because we want it to have the full border radius, and that kind of puts it back in place. And then what we want to do is we want to actually create a border. So let's see if we can create a border on this particular div. So let me go ahead and come into here. I'm going to say border T for border top, and we'll make that for now. Let's just say 4 pixels. In fact, let's go ahead and create the whole thing. I'll say border 4, and we'll say border red, just so we have it showing up, red 500, just so we can see where that border is. So that border is great, and we want the border to be there, but we want the border to be the full 6 pixels. So I'm actually say border 6 pixels to make that 6 pixel wide border. And we want a specific border to be colored. So we actually want most of the border to be transparent. So I'm going to say border transparent, and then we'll say border T fuchsia 500 to make just the specific top border fuchsia 500. As you can see, that adds this great effect, because then we can spin that particular border, and then we can have it just on 25% of the border instead of the entire thing. That just gives us a line that we can rotate. Now we don't want it to be quite that bright, so we are going to bring that down to 30% opacity just by saying /30 here, and that just gives it a nice little 30% opacity that we can use to lighten that up. And then we can go ahead and spin this as well. So we'll do that with Framer Motion. I'm going to import motion from Framer Motion. And then in here, we're going to turn this into a motion.div, and we'll have an ending motion.div as well. In fact, we don't even have to do that. We could just do a self-closing div here because there's nothing inside of it, and that will create that motion div. And then we just need to add animation properties to this div. Now, of course, we want this to rotate, so we're going to say that the animate prop is going to be equal to, and then we're going to say rotate 360, and let's see what that does when we hit save. And it looks like it does rotate it, but it's very, very fast. And of course, we want it to continue to rotate as well. So we're going to set some transition properties to ensure that that happens. So on our transition object, we're going to say that the ease is going to be linear, that the duration is going to be, let's just say 30 seconds for now, and that the repeat is going to be infinity. And that should hopefully go ahead and spin that around. Let's go ahead and refresh this again and see if we get it to rotate around. So it is rotating around. It's actually a little bit slow. So let's just speed that up just a bit by saying duration 20 and see if that looks any better as we refresh the page. So I'm going to refresh this again. We are seeing that a little bit sped up. Let's just go ahead and give it just a tiny bit more with duration 15 and refresh one more time and see if that speeds it up enough. And it does look like a nice effect right now. So I'm seeing that nice little transition where we have our duration working and everything is looking good. And as it rotates all the way around, then it's just going to continue through the entirety of the time that someone is looking at this section. Now, the only thing I want to do is make sure that not all of our circles are rotating. We actually want some of these to rotate, but not all of them. So that means that we need to control this with some kind of a prop. So we're going to accept a prop to tell this whether this is an animated circle or not. So I'm going to go ahead and give this an and we're going to say animate, and it's going to be an optional prop. Of course, it's going to be a Boolean, which means it's either going to be true or false. And then we can then destructure that animate prop from this, and that's going to allow us to control whether we actually add this animation on here at all. So animate is going to be equal to false. And of course, we're going to go ahead and say if animate is true, then we're going to give it this rotation of 360. So as soon as we save that and refresh, we shouldn't see anything animated right now. And indeed, we do not. We also want our border to only be there if it's animated. And of course, we can do that with Tailwind merge. I already have the TW merge function included here, so I'm going to use it. I'm going to say TW merge, and we're going to wrap this entire class name with that. And then now that we have that, we can just go ahead and say animate and then add our animation classes as well. So I'm going to take this border. In fact, just the border top fuchsia 500 should do the trick. So I'm just going to cut that one out of here. And then when it's animated, we'll add the top border fuchsia in, and that will ensure that and I need a comma there as well to make that valid JavaScript. And that will ensure that we only have the border when it's an animated circle. So coming back to my hero.tsx, let's go ahead and add that animate prop to one of our circles. So I'm going to add it to this. So I'm going to say animate here, and that will allow that particular circle to animate. And then as we move down, we can kind of pick and choose which ones we're going to animate. I kind of like that effect. I want this one over here to animate as well. So I'm going to come down to my cuboid and ensure that that one is animating as well. So I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to say animate, and that will ensure that that one is animating as well. Now that's a great effect. Now let's move on to our hexagon animation, where we're going to have a line animating around our hexagon. I'm going to close out my circle.tsx, come back into my hero, and talk about how we're going to do that. Now, of course, we have a hexagon component that we're currently using, and that hexagon component is what we're going to use to do our animation as well. Now, in order to start animating our hexagon, let's talk about how we're actually going to accomplish this. So I'm going to come into my sidebar and come into my hexagon component, and then we'll talk about how we need to animate this. Let me close up my sidebar again. So we need to overlay two different shapes, kind of like we did in our circle. We need a shape that we can overlay on top of our hexagon that's exactly the same as our hexagon. So essentially we need to duplicate this SVG, and in order to get that to work, we need to layer an absolutely positioned one onto our relative one. So I'm going to wrap this in a div with a class name of inline flex to ensure that we have a wrapper for this that we can position relative. I'm going to give this a relative position, and then our SVG, I'm going to duplicate it. So I'm going to just copy and paste that SVG down here. Looks kind of wild right here, but that's because it's not absolutely positioned yet. So let me go ahead and position the second one absolute, and that should fix that problem. Now you can see it's a little bit lighter, and that's because we have now a duplicated SVG, both of them having 10% opacity. Together they probably have that 20% opacity from that text fuchsia 500. So we're not going to worry about that quite yet. What we are going to talk about is how are we actually going to get a line that animates around our hexagon. And I'm actually going to show you what we're going to do. So we need to edit some styles here in order to see what we're going to accomplish. So the first one is going to be our stroke dash array. So let me talk about this one for a second. So I'm going to add on a stroke dash array, and this is going to be equal to a string, and that's going to set the value of how long our stroke is and then how long our dash is. So if I said 30 here, for example, on this one, and I hit save, and I'm going to go ahead and bring up the opacity of this to like a 30, then you'll see that every 30 pixels we have stroke, and every 30 pixels we have dash. If we wanted to make the dash twice as long, we could say 3060, and that will add a longer dash. Now, as the second number goes up, we'll just be left with a single dash if it gets high enough. So if we say 9999 on our second number, you'll notice that we actually only have a 30 pixel stroke, and that's actually hidden right now behind this circle. So let's actually make that a little bit longer as well and just say something like 200. And it's starting to peak out here. If we increase that first stroke to 300, 400, and then of course 500, then we can see that stroke continue to grow. But of course, we're not seeing a second stroke because the dash is so long. So if we are at 500, 500, we'd see a 500 pixel stroke, then a 500 pixel dash, then a 500 pixel stroke again. But of course, we would like to see just one single stroke and then the rest of the shape be a dash. So I'm going to increase this to my 999 value, and then we'll see just a single stroke. Now, to get this to actually animate around our hexagon, what I'm going to do is animate a property called the stroke dash offset. So I'm going to add on here, just so I can demonstrate this, stroke dash offset, and that's going to be a number that tells it how far offset from the beginning this thing should be. So if I give this a positive value, let's say I give this a value of 500, it actually goes counterclockwise, and if it's negative, it actually goes clockwise. And if you see I have a negative 500 here, you're actually seeing it up top. If I go down to 400, it starts coming back towards the start. 300, 200, you can see that it's starting to animate in that counterclockwise direction. But the higher I make my negative number, let's go back to 500, and let's go up to 600 and save it. You can see it's starting to animate around 700. It's going further, 800. So if we want to animate this clockwise, which of course we do, then we want to give this stroke dash offset a negative value and then continue to increase this. And by animating this number, we can animate this stroke around our shape. Now, at some point, this stroke will stop showing. We actually saw this with our positive value. When it gets to the start of this shape, let's go ahead and hide our circle for a second so we can see exactly where that start is. So I'm going to come to my torus, and I'm just going to go ahead and comment this out for now. So I'm just going to do a command / and that will comment that out. And then let's go ahead and look at this again with that torus gone. Let me go back to my stroke dash offset of 0, and let's start going in the positive direction. So I'm gonna go 100 and then 200. And it's actually going, this is the start position of this shape for some reason. And that is the position where it's actually going backwards, but it's actually disappearing into the start. And the same thing is true if we go so far in our negative direction, we'll eventually get to the end and it will start to disappear. So if I go to negative 200 and then I continue around and go negative 1,000, and we can see that it's now over here. If we go negative 2,000, you can see that it's now down here, negative 3,000. It's actually starting to disappear. So let's actually go to 2,500 and see where that's at. Okay, so 2,600, 2,700. And so now it's at the end and it's actually starting to disappear. The only way to actually get this to work is to have a perfect stroke dash array where you can measure the outside of this path and have this be the exact length. So your stroke is 500 and essentially your dash is whatever the length of this is minus 500. So it equals the entire length. And then if this will never start or end. So if you go backwards, it'll actually continue to just go, and you'll see it continue, and then forwards it'll continue to do the same thing. So that's essentially what we want to get to. Now there is a way that we can measure our path, which of course is going to be crucial to get this infinite animation that we want to happen for this particular hexagon. So we'll talk about that here in a second. What we're going to do is we're going to make this second one, we're going to make this a motion SVG. But in order to understand the values that we need to add in here, we actually need to measure the path. We need to measure what's right here. And actually we have two of them, so we can choose which one we want to measure. So I'm actually going to measure this top one. And to measure it, I need to access the DOM element, which means I need to create a ref for this path. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to say const path ref. It's going to be equal to a use ref, a React use ref. And I'm just going to hit enter to import that. And then we're going to add that to the path itself. So I'm going to say ref equals path ref. And that's going to allow us to access the DOM element. Now it's saying that we don't have the right type on this. It's an SVG path element. So we need to just tell this that this could be an SVG path element, and it has a default value of null. So as long as we do that, we should be able to use that ref without any warnings. When this element enters the page, we want to do that calculation to see how long this path actually is. So in order to do that, what we want to do is we want to have a use effect. And actually, I'm going to actually use a use layout effect because this has a very special power. The use layout effect actually will allow this component to render before it actually shows in the browser, just so that you can measure things before the component actually displays. So that's actually a really great function that we're going to use, and I need to import that from React. So I'm going to say use layout and hit enter when that shows up, and you can see that it's being imported up top here. And then by giving this empty bracket, we're saying just do it when the SVGs and all that first come onto the page. So let me go ahead and get that measurement of this entire path. And how I do that, there's actually something I can use called a get total length of a path ref. So I'm going to say const path length, and that's going to be equal to my path ref dot current dot get total length. And you can see that that function exists right here, and that's going to give me my path length. Now, if this path ref were undefined for any particular reason, it shouldn't be, but if it were, then this would give us undefined. We'll have to account for that here in a second with what we want to do with this. Now, the problem with this get total length is this get total length works, but it actually gives us the total length if the SVG were 82 pixels wide. That's obviously not true here because we've scaled it with our styling. We've actually scaled this up pretty large. I think it's like 800 pixels in width right now. And so this is not going to be helpful for us unless we have a way to scale that. And the only way for us to really be able to tell how wide this is, because of styling and rotation makes it very difficult to calculate the size, we need the actual user of this hexagon to tell us with a prop how big this hexagon should be. So I'm actually going to add in a size prop, and that's how we're going to know what the hexagon size is. And this is just going to be the width of the hexagon. I also need to add this into my props. So I'm going to say and a size, which is an optional value, and it's going to be a number. And just so that we can see this, we're going to give this a default value of 800 just so that we can continue to see this hexagon over here. Otherwise, it would be too small to actually hide under our icosahedron or over here. So we're going to use this size ref to actually dynamically scale this SVG. I'm going to come below my class name. I'm going to give this a style, and I'm going to say the height is going to be equal to the size, as well as the width is also going to be equal to our size. And we're going to do the same thing with our absolutely positioned SVG. We're going to come below here, and we're going to say that the height is equal to the size, as well as the width is also equal to the size. Now that we have that ref in there, that should allow us to be able to get a scaled path length. So that will say const scaled path length, and that's going to be equal to whatever our path length is when it's not scaled times whatever our size is divided by what our initial width was. So initial width was 82. That should give us this scaled number right here. So our path length could be undefined, and that's the problem I told you about right here. So I'm just basically going to say if that for any reason that path length is undefined, that DOM element is not there. If not path length, we can return. That way we don't get any kind of weird errors there. Our path is now being scaled with our size prop, and we are getting a scaled path length here. Now this is the total length of our path. That's really helpful information because that will help us to set a correct stroke dash array, as well as what value we should be animating this to as well. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll actually set that and save that into our state. So I'm going to say const scaled path length, or actually just go ahead and call this total path length, and then we'll say set total path length, and that will be equal to a React use state. Now we can set this, so we have this number right here. We can just go ahead and say that the set total path length of whatever our scaled path length is, and that will allow us to go ahead and set that state value. Now this is going to say right now that we have a number, and that's not really allowed on undefined. That's because we haven't told this that this could definitely be a number at some point in the future. So we'll just add that number there, and that will tell it that it can be a number when this gets set. So once we set that, we should get a total path length. Well, at that point, that would be a great time for us to go ahead and render our second SVG, and we'll go ahead and turn this into a motion SVG because we want this to be able to animate along with Framer Motion. So I'm going to import motion from Framer Motion like we've done with our other animated components. I'm going to turn this into a motion.svg, and we'll go ahead and end that with a motion.svg as well. And then we only want this to render though if we have this total path length, because if we don't, then we're not going to have the values for some of these different styles that we want to add in here. So I'm going to say total path length and that's going to ensure that we only render this motion SVG if we have that value set. Now, if we do, then we can add these styles and we can set them to the proper values. So let's go ahead and interpolate this value right here. And let's say that it's going to be 500, and then it's going to be whatever our total path length is, minus 500 is going to be the dash. So it's going to be a stroke of 500, and then the rest of it is going to be a dash. And then we also want to animate this stroke dash offset. And we'll do that with our animation props that we'll add to this motion SVG as well. So I'm going to say initial is going to be equal to a stroke dash offset of 0. And then our animate, or what it's going to animate to, is going to be a stroke dash offset of total path length times -1. So essentially it's going to go around the whole way, and then it should start over because we're going to add the options that will tell it to repeat infinitely. So I'm going to remove this stroke dash offset here because we don't need that anymore. And then I'm going to set my transition options by setting transition, the transition prop, and I'm going to say that the repeat is going to be infinity to have it infinitely repeat. And let me go ahead and save this to see if this is actually doing anything yet. And of course, I'm going to go ahead and refresh my page as well. And yes, this is definitely repeating, but wow, that's almost a laser-like effect. So let's go ahead and slow that way down. Let me change my duration to 30 and see what that looks like. And of course, we also want it to be ease linear. That'll make it just a very smooth, consistent effect. So let me refresh my page once again, and I should see that animating around, which I do. So we can see that, and let's just let it go all the way through. In fact, I'll just go ahead and speed it up a little bit so that we can see it go all the way through a little bit quicker. So I'm going to save that, refresh that, and see if it does indeed go all the way around. Now remember, this is both hexagons on top of each other, so it's a little bit lighter than it should be right now. We're going to split these up into our separate hexagons. So right here, it should go all the way around. We're seeing it smooth animate. Oh, that is perfect. That's exactly what we wanted, and that works really, really well. So I like where this is at right now. Now let's go back to our hero section and just go ahead and update our size props and everything we need to do here. So I'm going to put back my circle on top of this by just going ahead and uncommenting that code. And then for our hexagons, which are up at the top of the page, we need to go ahead and add a size prop to them. So this one is going to be size equals 1100 for the first one, and the second one is going to be size equals 1800. And that will allow those hexagons to be there. Now we are seeing a little bit of a change in where our absolute positioned elements are. Let me just go ahead and double check that these are okay. So we just need to refresh our page, and that allowed our motion divs to be in the right spot. Now we can add a couple other options here that'll just go ahead and add another level of polish to our hexagon animation. And one of those options could be, what if we allowed the user to decide whether this was reversed or not? So in that case, the stroke dash offset would either, if it was reversed, it would be in the positive direction. If it was not reversed, it would be in the negative direction. And that'd be a nice option to add. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in. We're going to say that we can add a reverse option as a prop. That's going to be optional. It's going to be Boolean. So it's either going to be true or false. And then we're going to destructure that one as well. So we're going to say reverse here, and that's going to be equal to false. But if the user adds true there, then it will be reversed. So I'm going to come down here and I'm going to say that it's going to be either reverse, or which will just be total path length, or it's going to be not reversed, which is just going to be normal. That's going to be total path length times -1. So let's go ahead and save that. That adds the option, but it doesn't do it yet. So we're going to take the outer bigger hexagon and we're just going to say reverse, and that should move that in the reversed direction. So let me refresh my page and see if we see that coming along the bottom here. And indeed we do. We see that coming along and moving very nicely. And then in the inner one, we see that moving as well. The only other option I think I want to add to this animation is the option to set the duration, because I'd like to probably slow down the outer one a little bit. Since it's a bigger hexagon, it'd be great to be able to slow that one down. And then we can just go ahead and leave the inner one as is. So I'm going to come into my hexagon and I'm going to set the duration to 30, but of course we want to add an option to be able to set that as well. So I'm going to give it an option within TypeScript. I'm going to say duration, and that's going to be an optional number. And then if that number is set, of course we can use it. So I'm going to say duration, destructure that. That's going to be equal to a default of 30. And then we'll come down here to our duration and just basically make that the value of that prop. So let me go ahead and refresh this once again and see if we can see that happening. So I'm going to pull this out so I can get a full view of my browser, come up and down and look. And we do see that this is still a little faster than I would like. So I'm going to come into my hero and just update that value. Let's come into my hero And the outer one, the 1800 one, is going to be duration, and we're going to set that to a value of 60 to make that happen over 60 seconds. Let me bring that back out. Let me refresh my page and see if that is a lot slower on the outside. So I'm going to see when this comes here. It's definitely slower, and now it looks really nice. It has a nice slow effect that kind of matches what our circle is doing, kind of matches what our interior hexagon animation is doing. I really like where that's going right now, so I'm happy with how that looks. This section is really coming together. Now, as I pull my browser window back in, the last animation that we're going to be worried about is our mouse animation here at the bottom. So this is going to be the scroll to learn more, and we just want this mouse to kind of scroll down a little bit just to give it a little touch of animation there as well. So I'm going to come into my hero section. Let me go ahead and close up my hexagon. We're done with that for now. And come into my hero and find my mouse, and we'll talk about how we can animate that as well. So the mouse button is this div right here that has a height of 12 pixels, a width of 4 pixels. That's what we're going to want to animate, and we can do that with a motion.div as well. So we can say motion.div and end our motion.div, or just make that a self-closing div. That will work as well. And then we can add some props to allow this to animate. I think what I'd like to do is have the translation move the mouse wheel kind of down the mouse a little bit, and then the opacity also fade out. So we kind of have a smooth kind of scroll look, and then it'll pop back up and do a smooth scroll down again. So let's try and make that happen. So for my animate prop, I'm going to say translate Y, and that's going to be 12 to make it translate in the Y direction 12 pixels down. And then we're also going to make our opacity fade out a little bit. We're going to say 0.2 to just make that fade out to 20% opacity. And then we're going to set how that transition happens. So let's say the transition is going to be over a duration of 2 seconds. We're going to have the ease be linear. We're going to have the repeat happen infinitely with infinity here. And then we're going to have the repeat type be loop, but it should do that by default. So let's go ahead and save that and just see if that looks correct. So I'm seeing that come out and I'm seeing it come back in. So it's just giving it that little bit of a almost like scroll like effect. And let me just make sure that the repeat type, it should be loop by default, but I just want to make sure that we're not missing anything there either. So I'm going to save that and go ahead and refresh our page and make sure that that is still working well. So yes, I am seeing that work well, and I like where that's at. So I'm happy with that. I'm going to go ahead and leave that as is. That's going to be the animation for the mouse. So with that, the hero animation is completely done. We did 4 different things. We did the circle animation, we did this hexagon line, we did the scroll animation that moves our 3D shapes, and we did the mouse animation. That's a whole lot of animation that we put into this, but it definitely adds another level of polish and wow to this section. This is a very, very impressive section that you should be proud to have built along with me here. Let's go ahead and move on to our next section and look at the animations on that one. Now that we have our hero section done, let's go ahead and move on to the animations that we're going to add for our features card. So let's go ahead and open up that section and talk about what we can do in order to get these to animate over automatically and as we click through these dots down here. Now let's start with the actual dot clicking. We need a way to save what the current selected dot is, and of course the go-to way in React is state. So let me go ahead and add a const for selected card index, and then we'll say set selected card index. That'll be the way that we can set that state equals use state. And that will start off with a value of 0. Let me make sure that my use state is imported by going ahead and selecting it from the list right here, and that should import that at the top of our file, which it does. Moving down to our card data, we want to change the color of our selected dots. So let me go ahead and put in my sidebar so that we can see this a little bit better and see what we need to do in order to make this update happen. So they're currently BGZinc 500. We can probably change that with TW-merge. So let me go ahead and add the TW-merge function, go to the end of my class names and add that other parentheses there. And then we want to say if it's the selected one, so if this particular index is selected, we want to add probably a BGZinc of something like 300. So we need to know what index we're working with. So right now we're just getting the title, but we're not really getting the index. Let me go ahead and say card index here. So this will loop through the card indexes as we're looping through this card data. And then we'll say if the card index is equal to our selected card index, then we want to add the class of BG Zinc 300, and that will be added to our dot and override our BG Zinc of 500. Of course, we need to add a comma here in between these, and that's what it's throwing a fit about. So let me go ahead and save that, and let's see what that does right away if we refresh our page. So now we can see that we have this first dot selected. We're not doing anything else as we move through these dots yet, so we need to also add that on. So we're going to say on click, and that's going to be equal to a function that's basically going to say set selected card index, and it's going to be equal to whatever one we clicked. So that's going to be equal to the current card index that we're on. So we should be able to click through and go to 1, 2, and 3. We currently can't though, and that's once again due to the way that Astro is server rendering this rather than client-side rendering it. So let's go to our sidebar, let's open up our index, and let's make sure that this section is being client loaded as well by adding in our client load here, and then we should be able to click through and actually see these change. And we do. As the state changes, we are seeing these dots change as well. So come back to our feature cards. Let's go ahead and close out our sidebar once again, and let's talk about how to get these to actually animate. We have a selected card index, and of course we can get that selected card index from here as well, and I'm going to do that. I'm going to go ahead and get my card index here, and then we're just going to see if the two align, and of course if they do, we're going to want to move the cards based on which one is selected. So right from the start, 0 is selected. That's the one we want to have in the first position. But if 1 is selected, we want this one to be in the first position, and so on and so forth as we move through our different cards. So how we're going to do that is we're going to create a div that's going to wrap our cards. That ending div should be right there. And then we're going to add a transform based on the card index that's selected. Now let me talk about how we're going to do this here for a second. So I'm going to say style equals, and it's just going to be transform and then translate X, and we're going to translate this X value in a way that is relative to what we have selected. So if we did negative 100%, for example, if we translated X negative 100%, we would see the second one come to the front. It's not quite in the exact place because we also have to account for the gap in between. That gap is 2 rems. So really we should have negative 100% minus 2 rems, and that would be equal to the second one being in that first position. As I refresh my page, it should be exactly there. And excuse me, I do need to add a calc in here as well. So let me add a calc, negative 100% minus 2 rems. That should go ahead and make sure that that's in that first position. And then if we multiply this value then by 2 or 3, then we'll get the other cards into the first position as well. So essentially, if our selected value, let me go ahead and do that real quick. So I'm going to say times 2, and let's just go ahead and wrap a parentheses around this as well so that we have order of operations working out well. So if it's times 2, we get this one. If it's times 3, we get the next one. So it's basically 0, 1, 2, or 3 that we could have here. Well, what are those? Those are indexes of selected cards. So we could replace this multiplied value with our selected card index, and that will allow us to directly control which card is going to end up in this first position. So with this interpolated value, I'm just going to say times my selected card index, and that's going to allow us to say which value is here. So now we just have to say, well, if it's the 0 is the index, then it's of course the first one, but if 1 is the index, then it's the second one. If 2 is the index, it's the third one, and so on and so forth. So the default value is of course 0. Now, if we go ahead and click our dots, what do? Well, that allows us to directly control which one is in the first position with that transform. So that works really well. We're not getting any kind of animation yet, and of course we want to add that animation, and we can do that just by adding some CSS animation on this particular div. So I'm going to give this a class name, and of course I want to make sure that this is flexed correctly. I'm going to say inline flex, and then I'm just going to say transition all to make sure that we have this transition happening between our different translates, and then I'm going to say duration 500, and that should add a 500 millisecond duration between these translates so that it looks more like it's being animated, and I really like how that is turning out. Now, in order for this to automatically happen, we need something set up to go ahead and look at this card value and be able to reset it every so often, and that's going to happen with a use effect. So let me come here and add a use effect that's coming from React, and that's going to be a function that runs, and that is going to change every time we have our selected card index change, and it's just going to set a timeout, which is going to basically set a timer, And then when that timer runs out, it's going to run this function here. So let's say every 2 seconds or 200 milliseconds, that timer runs out, and then it's going to change this card index. So we're going to say set selected card index from whatever it currently is. Let's change it to whatever it is +1, unless, of course, that value is longer than the current number of cards, in which case we just want that to be 0. So if the cur is equal to our card data dot length -1, then we want to set it to 0. Otherwise, we'll just set it to whatever it is +1. So that should help us every 2 seconds to change that. Let's see it. It's increasing here. It increased again. It increased again. Then it should go back to 0 because of that ternary statement that we have right here. So that works well. If we want that to happen over 2 seconds, I think I set it for 3 seconds by default. That'll slow it down just a little bit. And then the only other thing we want to add in here is the ability to make sure that we clear our timeout because we have multiple timeouts happening right now. We definitely don't want that. We want to clear our timeout if our selected card index is set automatically. So let's go ahead and save that timeout. I'm going to say const timeout is equal to that set timeout. And then we're going to return a function that's going to clear that timeout just like so. And that should help make sure that the old timeouts are cleared and only the current one is going to be the one that's running. So if we manually change this, then this use effect is going to run again. It's going to make sure the old one is cleared out, and it's going to start the timer over at 3000. So let's go ahead and double check that by just going through. We can still click through, and then when we let go and let it do its thing, then it should start animating again every 3000 milliseconds or 3 seconds. And then the only way to ensure that if we're hovering, that we go ahead and ensure that we don't have a timeout anymore is to say that if one of these divs is hovered, that we go ahead and clear our timeout automatically, or we just return. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to save another state, and that's going to be whether one of those cards is hovered. So I'm going to say const is hovered, set is hovered is equal to a use state, and by default that's going to be false. And then when we hover these, so if we say on mouse enter, we're going to run a function that sets that to true. So set is hovered to true. And then when we leave, so on mouse leave, we're going to run a function that's going to set it back to false. So set is hovered to false. That will allow us to have the state of whether one of these cards is being hovered or not. Now that's helpful because in this use effect, we could basically say every time it's hovered, let's just go ahead and not do anything. Let's not set a timeout, and that will allow us to kind of stop our animation that we had here. So I'm going to add my is hovered, so it's going to be watching that value. And then if is hovered is equal to true, so if is hovered, then we're just going to return, and that's going to ensure that we don't have any animation when this is being hovered. So let me save that. Let me refresh my page and let's see if this works. So right now I'm not hovering those cards, so we should see it animate. And then as soon as I hover one, we should see that pause as long as I'm hovered. And then if I take my mouse away, we should see it start to animate again after 3 seconds. So that's working well. That works great. It's looking amazing. I love what this is doing. I actually want to clean up one more thing while we're here, and that is the card color, because we haven't added that in yet, but each of our card data items does have an associated color. So let's go ahead and make sure that that card color is being added in just by adding a prop to here. So I'm going to say color equals, and that's going to be equal to the color that we're passing in from the card data. So let me go ahead and save that. And that should be a wrap. I don't think we needed this card index. I don't remember right offhand why I wanted to use that, but let me go ahead and take that off, and that should be a wrap for this section. So this is looking great. We now have our card colors. We can now click through each of these cards and see these. And of course we can have it automatically hover. And of course we can have it automatically animate if we are not hovering that section either. So this is looking awesome. It's time to move on to animations in the next section. As we move below our features cards, we get into our features grid. And in this case, I'm going to kind of slide my browser window over because we can look at this without having a lot of the windows showing. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to open up my features grid, and we're going to talk about how to make this section have the great parallax effect that you probably saw in the demo. Now, in order to do that, we're going to have to do a couple of things. One of them is we're going to start wanting to track each one of these images over here. So in order to do that, I need to add a couple of refs. So I'm going to add on a ref here. I'm going to say const torus not ref. That's going to be equal to use ref. from React. I'm just going to import that. And I'm also going to have my const first hemisphere ref, and that's going to be equal to use ref as well. And then I'm going to add these onto my two images. So this is the first one. I'm going to say that my ref is equal to torus not ref. And my second one, I'm going to have a ref equal to first hemisphere ref. And React is going to throw a little bit of a hissy fit here because we don't have this set to null by default. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that that is set to null, and hopefully that should take care of that TypeScript error, which it looks like it does. Now that we've done that, let's go ahead and import our motion components as well. So I'm going to import motion from Framer Motion like we've done, and then I want to change these to motion images instead of just images. That's going to give these the power to create the animations that we want to create with them without continually refreshing our component or re-rendering our component. It's going to make these animations super smooth. And we want to do a couple of things. For our torus knot, as we scroll, we want to both move it up and we want to rotate it. So let's create both of these up here. First, we want to use scroll. That's going to allow us to track the scroll position. I hit enter, that imported my use scroll function, and then I'm going to say that the target of that is going to be the torus knot ref, and the offset is going to be start and end start, and that will ensure that it happens over the entirety of the viewport. So as the start of the image gets to the end of the viewport until the end of the image reaches the start of the viewport, that's when this scroll progress is going to occur. And I'm going to say const scroll y progress. I believe that's the destructured variable that I can get, which it looks like it is, and then I can transform this into my other animated values that I want. So in order to do that, let's use transform to do that. So I'm going to say const torus knot translate y, and that's going to be equal to my use transform. I'm going to watch my scroll y progress, and actually I want to rename my scroll y progress because I'm going to be using this a lot. I'm going to track 4 different positions. So this is going to be my torus knot scroll y progress. And then I'm just going to copy and paste this into my use transform. And then as it goes from 0 to 1, for my rotation, or my translation, I should say, I'm going to go from 100 to negative 100. So it's going to move up. It's going to start at a value of plus 100. It's going to move to negative 100. And then I also want to rotate this. So I'm going to say const torus knot rotate, and that's going to be equal to another use transform. Much like my first one, I'm going to track the torus knot scroll y progress as it moves from 0 to 1, and I'm going to rotate this from 30 to negative 30, and that should just go from 30 degrees to negative 30 degrees. Now let's go ahead and drop that onto our image and see if we can actually see that happen. So I'm going to say style equals, and for my translate, I'm going to add translate here, translate y, and then I'll just add my torus knot translate y, and then for my rotate, I'm going to add my torus knot rotate, and that should help both of those styles show up on the page as we scroll. Now, as we scroll up, you can notice that this actually isn't doing anything right now, and that's because we haven't yet client loaded this particular section. So I'm going to come into my index and I'm going to add on to the features grid client load, and that should ensure that it actually does load. So as I scroll, now that our client has loaded and we are seeing our client JavaScript added in, now we see that translation and rotation actually happening in our grid on our torus image. Okay, so that's essentially what we want to do, but we want to do that a little bit differently for each of our images. So our torus knot image, we have our hemisphere image, our first hemisphere, which we're going to add a little bit of different styles to. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and kind of copy and paste what we have here to our first hemisphere. So I'm going to paste this, and then we're just going to change some of these things around. Of course, the scroll progress is now not going to be the torus knot. It's going to be first hemisphere scroll y progress. And then this is going to also be first hemisphere here. Let me just go ahead and copy and paste the variable value that we're using. So this is going to be the first hemisphere translate, and this is also going to be the first hemisphere rotate. And it's going to pay attention to the first hemisphere ref, and we're also going to pay attention to these transforms are going to be based on the first hemisphere scroll Y progress. So we have essentially the same thing happening here, but we also want to change these values because we're not going to use the same 100 negative 100. We're also not going to use the same 30 negative 30, I don't believe. So let's go ahead and change these. So the first one is going to be this translate. We're going to change it from 50 to negative 50. So it's going to move about half the speed as our torus knot does. And then for our rotation on this one, we're going to change it to negative 20 and 10. So it's actually going to move in the opposite direction, the rotation, as our torus knot is. And then we just need to add these onto our image as well. So on this motion image right here, we're going to say style equals, and then we're going to say translate Y is going to be equal to our first hemisphere translate Y, and then our rotation is going to be equal to our first hemisphere rotation, and that should add those dynamic values. So let's see this actually happen. So this is not exactly what I was expecting. I think I was actually expecting it to do something a little bit different. So let's switch around these values to 20, negative 10 and see if that was what I was expecting to happen here. And it still isn't quite it. Let me see if we need to go to a lower initial value. So I'm going to go to negative 20 and maybe go to negative 50 here and see if that's more like what I was expecting. Yes, that definitely does look more like it, where we kind of get to almost like a flat surface, but it starts out really rotated. And of course, it also comes up as we go. So that looks like a really good effect there. I really like where that's going. So I'm going to leave this at that negative 20 and that 50, and that works really well. Now coming down to our next part, we need to animate these as well. So these are also going to have that same kind of parallax effect. And so we need to track each of these as well. So let's first start with the refs, and we're going to kind of do what we did with our first hemisphere. So I'm going to kind of copy this and paste this down here to create a new ref. We need to copy this and paste it again to create some new translations and rotations. And all that is going to, excuse me, it looks like it did the wrong thing. Let me go ahead and try that again. Let me copy that and paste this down here. And then we can go ahead and start changing some of these variables and the properties, and that should allow us to see these translations happen. So for this one, we're going to say cone ref is going to be equal to this one. And so we're going to say cone scroll Y progress is going to be tracking the cone ref. And then for our translation, we're going to have our cone translate Y is going to be paying attention to the cone scroll Y progress. The same thing is true down here, and this is also going to be cone rotate. So now we have a cone ref, we have the tracking of the scroll Y progress of that cone, and then we have a couple of translates and rotates. Now let's see what values we want to add here as well. So I think on the rotation side, that's going to be the value right here. We're going to go from 12 to 45, and then on the translation, we're going to do similar to our torus knot, where we're going 100 to negative 100. Let's just see how that looks as we go ahead and move our page up and down. Now, these aren't connected to anything yet, so let's go ahead and come down to our second set of images. We need to make these motion images. We need to add our refs. So the ref should be our cone ref, and then we should add our styles here. So it's going to be translate Y is equal to cone translate Y, and then our rotate is going to be equal to our cone rotate, and that should ensure that we have the right styles there. So as we move, we're going to see it translate and also rotate. So it's almost like pointing to the upright direction as we move, and I think that looks really good. For our hemisphere, we need to make sure that that is added in there as well. So essentially, once again, it's going to be kind of a copy paste operation here. I'm going to copy and paste what we're doing here and moving this down. We could use a custom React hook here, but I think we're just going to just keep it as is just for ease of use here. So this is going to be our second hemisphere ref, and that's what we're going to pay attention to with our progress. This is going to be our second hemisphere scroll Y progress. I'm just going to copy that little bit of variable that we're using there, and I'm going to replace cone with that. So let me go ahead and do that. And that should give us a second hemisphere translate Y and a second hemisphere rotate. And then we should just need to make sure that we set our actual rotation and translation variables for that one. So this is going to be similar to our first one. We're going to say 50 and negative 50 for the translation. And then we're going to say, well, we're going to try negative 20 and 10 on this one and see if that actually creates a better rotation for that particular second hemisphere. So let's go ahead and take those values. Let's drop them into our motion image, our second one. Let's create a motion image out of this. Let's create a ref that attaches our second hemisphere ref. And then let's have a style that hooks up our translate Y with our second hemisphere translate Y and our rotation value with our second hemisphere rotate. And hopefully that will allow us to do that as well. So I'm seeing that, and that's pretty good. I really like what that is doing. So I'm going to let that do what it is doing right now. And I think that is a good value. Okay, so with that done, let's go ahead and slide this out and let's just see as we go over this section exactly what's going on. So as I scroll down the section, we can see that that's giving that nice parallax effect where it starts off and just rotates that knot. And then as the user scrolls down to the other feature grid, we can see that we also have our cone and that's rotating as well as our second hemisphere as well. So we have some nice kind of parallaxy type effects happening, and they're very smooth, very nice. Definitely taking advantage of all of the power of Framer Motion and everything that we're tracking in order to get this to work. So with that done, let's go ahead and move on to the next section where we're going to animate our latest posts. Coming down into our latest post section, essentially what we want to do for the animation for this section is make sure that this second column is animating as we scroll the page down to the position that it's at right now. So it should kind of start from the top of this other latest post and then animate down as we scroll down. So let's see how we're going to do that by opening up our sections and going to our latest posts section. As we've done before, we need to make sure that this is client loaded. So we should probably go right to our page index and make sure that our latest post is going to say client load, which we added that in there. So that directive should ensure that. And then we can go ahead and come back to our latest post and ensure that we can do what we need to do with our Framer Motion div. Now, in order to do that, what we know is that we're going to want to animate this second div. This is our flex call. It's going to have our margin top of 64 pixels. That's essentially what's offsetting this right now that we want to eventually have come down to 0. So if that's the case, we just need to animate this margin top, and we can do that with another use scroll. So I bring in my use scroll up top. So I say use scroll, that's coming from Framer Motion. I'm going to hit enter, that should import that. And we need a target, which we're going to set to a default value of undefined just while we set that target. And we also need an offset, which I'm just going to set to an empty array for now. So let's go ahead and create that target. That target is going to be the div itself that has the margin top on it. So I need a ref in order to see what position that div is in. So I'm going to say const target ref, and that's going to be equal to use ref that we're importing from React. And then I'm just going to need to set that target ref on that div. So this is going to be this div right here. We need to say ref is equal to target ref, and that should enable us to use that. And then it doesn't like that that's undefined. Let me go ahead and set that to a default value of null, and that should make TypeScript happier with what we've done. Now, with that, we just need to go ahead and make sure that our margin top is animating. So this also needs to be a motion div. Let me see if I can just do this from here. It doesn't look like I can. Let me go ahead and import motion from Framer Motion and then come down to that div and make that a motion div so that I can animate the styles of this without re-rendering my div. So I just made that a motion div. And then we need to go ahead and say style equals, and that's going to be equal to whatever margin that we set. So let's go ahead and say margin top, and that's just going to be equal to 0 for now. And as we save that, we see that that's coming up to 0, but of course we want to animate that to our 64 pixels. So let's see how we want to do that. So our offset in this one's going to be a little bit different. We've done start, end, and start, but that's not really what we want to do here. We want to say start, end. So as soon as that comes onto the page until we get about halfway through. So that's going to be start center is how we're going to define that. So when the start of this div gets to about the center, that's going to be the entirety of the progress. I'm going to say const scroll y progress as a destructured value is equal to our use scroll. So we can use a use transform here as well, and we'll transform that scroll y progress. So as that's going from 0 to 1, we'll be going from 0 to 64, and that will add that 64 pixels of margin. And then we'll just say const margin top is equal to that use transform. So that margin top value is what we're going to set down here in our margin top. So we're going to say style equals margin top, and that should set that margin top value as we scroll. Let me go ahead and refresh my page and see if we see any kind of movement on that motion div to change that margin top. And I see that I left my target as undefined, so of course that's never going to work. We need our target ref to be set here, and hopefully that should enable that to actually update. So okay, I think I saw it happen. Let me refresh and let me scroll down. And as you can see, this is moving a little bit. Pay attention to that. As we scroll, you can see that it moves all the way down. As we scroll back up, you can see that it moves up. So that is changing based on our scroll and then just animating into position. It's giving it a nice animated effect. Let's see that with full screen by pulling out our browser window and scrolling up. We can see that it's even. And then as we scroll down, that animation just kind of stops there in the center at that 64 pixels of margin. So that's looking really, really nice. I really like how that's happening. And then if we go over to the tablet view, it's probably even more pronounced just because the cards are a little thinner. So that is looking great over in that view as well. So that is pretty much it. That wasn't very complicated to get that to work. Of course, Framer Motion makes that really, really easy, which means we can move on to the next section of our page. Now that we've completed our latest post animation, let's go to our testimonials. What we'd like to do is have these animate into the screen, but we'd also like to have a little bit of a staggered effect. So let's go ahead and open up our sections/testimonials and talk about some ways that we can make this happen. I'm going to import the motion component from Framer Motion, and then I'm going to go down and look at my testimonials code. Now each of our testimonials is surrounded by this block quote, and since we can replace any JSX element, standard HTML element with a motion component, we can just turn this into a motion.blockQuote instead. So I can do that motion.blockQuote, and that will enable me to add those motion superpowers to this block quote. Now what we can do is we can also use a prop on a motion component called while in view, and while in view will enable us to only have things happen when the component is either first viewed or every single time it comes onto the screen. So if we said initial, so this would be where it was initially, and we said the opacity was 0 and the Y was pushed 24 pixels down, then we could say while in view, and we could add props here as well. So if we wanted these to animate in, we could say opacity and change it to 1 and then Y to 0 to bring those up those 24 pixels. And let's go ahead and save this and see what this looks like as is. And we're not going to see anything yet, and that's because, once again, we don't have this as a client loaded section. So I'm going to go over to my Astro index.astro page and make sure that this is client loaded by saying client load, and that should ensure that this does actually animate into the page. Now, if I come back to my testimonials, I'm gonna go ahead and put away my sidebar there for a second so we can take a better look at this code. We can see that we do have this initial and opacity coming in. And what we could do is we could add some sort of transition prop. And for the transition, we could set a delay. And of course, we could delay that based on the testimonial index. So we could have the first one delaying a specific amount of time, second one and third one, so on and so forth. So we could say delay, and then we could just say testimonial index times 0.5, and that would create our delay in between. So let's see if we have that working. So let me go ahead and refresh my page and scroll down. And then yes, we do have each one delaying its start, and then that comes in and it has a nice smooth effect. I don't love this effect right now. I wish it were a little bit different. First of all, I want the ease to be a little bit different. I want to say ease in out. And then I also like the transition time or the duration to be a little bit different as well. So I'm going to set the duration to 1 second and see if that looks any better. So after I save that, let's go ahead and give it another refresh. And we do see that that's a nice smooth experience there. And this, since it's while in view, I believe we should see this every single time we scroll to it. So let me scroll up and scroll back down, and yes, we do see it again. Scroll up again, and let's see, let's go scroll back down, and we do see it again. So that does happen every single time. If we only want to set that to once, which I do, so I only want this to happen once, I can also add a viewport prop, and that viewport will allow me to say once true, and that will essentially make sure that the first time it enters onto the screen, we have this animation happening, and then every single other time it's not going to happen. That looks really good. It's a nice effect as someone scrolls down the page. So with that, I think our testimonials animation is done. Let's go ahead and move on to our call to action. With our testimonials animation done, let's go ahead and scroll down to our call to action. This one looks a little bit different than we left it, and that's because we have changed the way that our hexagon shape works. So we need to go into this section and make sure that that is corrected to pass the correct props, but this should be a pretty easy animation because we've already done the work to go ahead and animate a lot of the components in this section. So let's go to the call to action.tsx, and then we'll look at our two hexagons here first. So the first hexagon says it's size 700. Well, we haven't passed in the new size prop that we added, so we need to add size 700 as a prop to it as well. That should mean that we don't really need this class name here either, so I'm going to go ahead and remove that class name prop altogether and just go ahead and leave the size 700. And the same thing is true of this size 1100 here. I'm going to go ahead and remove that and say size equals 1100, and that should ensure that it's correctly sized while not requiring us to directly set the size itself. So those things are working well. We know that we need to come over into our pages and into our index in order to make sure that this is a client loaded component. So we'll say client load on our call to action and come back to it. And that will right away start showing the animations for our hexagon. So after that, we just need to ensure that we have them set with the right props. So for our interior one, I'm going to go ahead and leave it alone. For our exterior one, I'm going to reverse the animation on that. And I also want the speed to be a little bit different. So I'm going to say duration, and I think I'm just going to go ahead and give it a value of 60 to make it nice and slow. I'm going to actually change this to 50 just because it's a little bit smaller than the one in our hero. So let's go ahead and refresh the page and see what we're left with. And they look like they're moving at about the same rate, and that's just because this outer one has a lot more ground to cover versus this inner one, but those are looking really good right now. I also want to go ahead and animate my circles. I think I want to make sure that both of these circles are animated, so we need to add some props to this as well. Let me go ahead and click into my circle, command click on Mac. That'll take me right to that component, or I could have gone to my components directory and opened that up. And let me see what props we have available to us. So we just have basically this animate equals false. So that's pretty easy to work with. Let me go ahead and close that out and come back to my circle and animate both of these just by adding the animate prop. If we add a prop without a value to a React component, React actually views this as true. So there's nothing more. You don't need to add, say, animate equals true, because that's exactly the same thing as just saying animate like so. And then the second circle, I'd like to do that as well. So I'm going to say animate on that one as well. And as soon as we save this, we should see both of our circles are now animating as well. The only other thing left to do then in this section is to ensure that these shapes are also rotating along with the scroll, similar to how we've done with our shapes in the header. So we need to add refs to both of these, and then we're just going to go ahead and make sure that as the container is scrolled, that these are moving along with it. So what I'm going to do for ref for this one is I'm going to come up here and I'm going to say const, and we're actually going to set a section ref. So I'm going to just take the ref for this section tag, and that's what I'm going to use to control my scroll. So I'm going to say section ref equals use ref from React, and we can go ahead and give that a default value of null. And then I'm just going to add this ref onto the end of my section tag and say section ref, and that will enable us to have that ref there. I'm going to close down my sidebar to give me a little bit more room to work with here. We also know that we need to use the scroll position of the user or the scroll position of the section ref. So I'm going to say use scroll, and you can see it automatically finds the right one. I'm going to hit enter there. That should import it as well. I'm going to come down here and add the target of the section ref that we just created. And then we need to add the offset as well. So the offset is going to be start, end, start, essentially saying when the start of this section reaches the end of the page right here, or the end of the viewport, until the end of the section reaches the start of the viewport. That's never going to completely happen, I don't think, unless it's on mobile, but even then, I don't think this footer is very tall. So we're never going to quite get to the end, but that's fine. It'll give us a value between 0 and somewhere before 1. After we've done that, we can go ahead and destructure our scroll Y progress. We can say scroll Y progress is equal to our use scroll. So we're just pulling out that scroll Y progress value, and then we can use this to transform our rotation on these two shapes. So With that, let's go ahead and add a rotation for our cuboid shape. So I'm going to say const cuboid rotate, and that's going to be equal to a use transform from Framer Motion. If I click it, it'll also import it here. And we're going to pay attention to the scroll Y progress. And as it goes from 0 to 1, for this particular one, we're going to go from 45 to negative 45. So we're going to rotate from right to left. And then we'll save that. And actually, if I make this just the rotation value, I can actually rotate both of these at once using the same use scroll and transformation here. So let's see actually what that looks like and see if we're happy with that. So I'm going to leave that rotate there. And then we just need to make sure that for our images, we change these over to motion images. So I'm going to say motion.img for the first one. And I don't apparently have that motion component imported yet. So I'm just going to go ahead and make sure that motion component is in here. And then I can use my motion.img. And the same thing is true for the second one. I'm going to say motion.img. And those both become motion images that we can rotate. Then we just need to add some styles. So the first one is going to be style equals, and I'm going to say rotate, and that's actually going to be equal to my rotate value that I just defined for the cuboid. So let's see what that looks like as we scroll. So I'm seeing a nice rotation there. I actually like where that is going. So that's actually, I thought it was going from right to left, but that's actually going from left to right. And that's a nice rotation there. I really like what that's doing. And I think that's actually going the opposite direction that I thought it was, but that's completely fine. And then the same thing is true down here. We're going to see style equals rotate. And I can just actually leave that as a single value because that means the key and value name are the same. And we could just leave it right like that. So if that is in our page, then I'm seeing both my cylinder and my cuboid rotate, and I like the way that they're rotating. It's a minor effect, but I think it adds a major impact to the section. Even with all of these other animations, I think that just that little bit of rotation just adds a nice effect to this section. So with that, we have the entire home page animated. We still have a lot of work to do because we're going to create an animated navigation and we're going to build our interior pages. But for now, this entire home page looks really nice. We learned a little bit about how Astro does this client load directive, and we learned a little bit about Framer Motion through all of these animations that we've done. This has been great, but I hope that you stay with me through the rest of this project. I hope you enjoyed part 2 of this video series. If you did, be sure and subscribe to be notified when part 3 launches. In the meantime, here's another great video for you to watch. I'll see you in the next video.